A mystery that refuses to rest. I know many of you watch this video as you drift towards sleep, but I urge you, before you settle in, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Now, make yourself comfortable. Take a deep breath. Let the stillness settle around you. The silence in Meridian Tower was a living thing, thick, oppressive, and unnatural. It didn't merely fill the space, it pressed against my eardrums like water at crushing depths, suffocating and endless. Around me, the ventilation system thrummed, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed too slow, too deliberate, like the building itself was breathing, watching. Above me stretched 27 floors of abandoned offices, their windows as dark and lifeless as the eyes of a long-buried corpse. And somewhere, in that maze of forgotten cubicles and shadowed conference rooms, something waited. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 39 years old. 3 weeks ago, I took a job as the night custodian of this forsaken tower, a building that should have been condemned long ago. The evacuation had been sudden, whispered rumors flooding the news but never the truth. One day, the building hummed with life and the next, it fell silent, abandoned, left to rot in the heart of Minneapolis. The property managers called it a temporary relocation. Structural concerns, they said, eyes darting away when they handed me the keys. The pay was too good, triple what I earned at my last job, and I needed the money. So I ignored the warning signs. From the first night, I noticed something impossible. Dozens of computers scattered throughout the offices, all powered on, all glowing with identical spreadsheets full of numbers that twisted and pulsed on the screens like living creatures. The power was supposed to be shut off save for essentials. Yet these machines hummed with electric life in a building that should have been dark. The spreadsheet contained rows of coordinates, precise and cold, 40.748817, minus 73.985428. 35.67602, 139.650027. Places I knew from headlines but had never visited. New York. Tokyo. London. Each location tethered to Meridian Tower by some invisible thread. Night after night, I copied these coordinates onto napkins, sticky notes, anything I could find, and mapped them. What I found was a patchwork of strange disappearances and impossible events, a sinkhole swallowing an entire city block in Manhattan, vanishing as mysteriously as it appeared, a Tokyo subway car frozen in time, its passengers gone without a trace, an entire London street swallowed by silence for a full day, with no explanation from the authorities. Each incident bore the same hallmarks: sudden onset, eerie silence afterward, and official suppression of facts. News reports felt carefully edited, sanitized of all but the barest details, as though the truth was a shadow they didn't want to cast into the light. But the building sensed my intrusion. My footsteps began to echo oddly, a half-second delay that suggested something unseen walked just behind me. Fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that made my skin crawl, casting impossible shadows that stretched and writhed against the cracked walls. Sleep fled from me. Even in the safety of daylight, my heart thundered like a wild animal trapped in a cage. The coordinates haunted me in my dreams, glowing in eerie green across the backs of my eyelids. I'd awaken drenched in cold sweat, tasting copper on my tongue, convinced that something unseen and silent, stood watching from the foot of my bed. There's more to this place than abandoned walls and forgotten files. Meridian Tower is alive with secrets, whispers of something dark, something waiting. And as the nights grow longer, the line between the living and the lost blurs. Tonight, I will take you deeper into that darkness. The air in Meridian Tower thickened, each night folding deeper into a suffocating embrace. Breath became a labor, as if the very oxygen was being leached away, replaced by something stale, recycled, and unkind. My lungs strained with every step, desperate to pull life from the choking atmosphere. The temperature betrayed reason. One moment an icy chill clawed at my skin, biting and relentless. The next, waves of heat rolled off the cold concrete walls, as though the building itself pulsed with a fevered breath. Then came the sounds, soft, almost conspiratorial whispers that seemed to curl around the silence like smoke. Papers rustled in offices abandoned for years, elevators chimed on floors I never called, their doors sliding open to reveal nothing but emptiness and stale air. Voices murmured in tongues unknown, weaving through labyrinthine corridors that seemed to resist the beam of my flashlight as if darkness itself were alive, stretching out to smother the light. Each time I chased these echoes, I found only cold, empty rooms, the source of the sound swallowed by the building's endless shadow. Paranoia settled like a second skin. By the third week, I was checking over my shoulder every few steps, the prickling sensation of invisible eyes burning into my back. My skin crawled despite the building's unnatural warmth, goosebumps raised on my arms as if my body sensed the unseen presence stalking me. I'd whirl around, heart pounding, only to be met with the slow, mocking sway of plastic plants caught in a breeze that should not exist. Worst of all was the waiting, each night expecting the computer's eerie green glow to finally die, the flickering numbers to fade. But they never did. Instead, those screens greeted me like watching eyes, luminous and accusing in the dark, scrolling coordinates that haunted the edges of reason. I dreaded every corner, every hallway where the glow waited, silent and patient. The elevators became enemies. I abandoned them after realizing they moved without command. While working on one floor, I'd hear the familiar ding, doors sliding open with a mechanical sigh, and rush to find them empty yet unnervingly warm, as if someone had just vanished inside. The button panels lit up in cryptic patterns, blinking like Morse code, but the messages eluded me, a code deliberately obscured. My hands betrayed me. A tremor took hold, subtle at first but relentless, growing worse each day. Simple acts became battles, steadying my coffee, writing coordinates, even grasping door handles. The shaking plagued my right hand, the one I used to record everything, as if my own body fought to silence the truths I chased. Then came the night that changed everything. On a Tuesday in my fourth week, I stood on the 15th floor, staring at the same spreadsheet that had haunted my nights. But this time, the numbers raced like frantic pulses, cycling coordinates so fast my eyes burned to keep pace. Suddenly, they stopped. The screen blazed with a single line of data, highlighted in angry red, pulsing like a heartbeat in the darkness. 2 coordinates, precise and unmistakable. The Meridian Tower itself. Next to it, the words that shattered my world. Marcus Webb, floor 15, northeast corner, office 1547. My legs buckled. I clutched the desk, knuckles whitening against the cold fake veneer. The building knew me. It knew exactly where I stood. And it was broadcasting me, folding me into its network of unexplainable phenomena. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling dropping with every shallow breath. Fluorescent lights buzzed louder, casting distorted shadows that twisted the familiar into something alien, something threatening. My phone was dead, swallowed by the building's oppressive silence. I had to document it. Hands trembling beyond control, I pulled out my camera and fired the flash. The sudden burst of light cracked through the gloom, but when my eyes refocused, the screen had shifted. New coordinates flooded in, followed by a chilling message. Stand by for initialization. A map unfolded on the monitor, satellite imagery zooming in with surgical precision, tracing paths through the earth as if the building's gaze stretched far beyond its crumbling walls. And I was caught in the center of it all. The map pulsed softly in the gloom, each zoom revealing more detail, roads, rivers, clusters of buildings, all connected by the threads of those coordinates. But it wasn't the places themselves that unsettled me, it was the pattern. Lines, thin and glowing, traced invisible pathways across the globe, linking distant points like a spider's web spun in shadows. I leaned closer, my breath shallow, as the screen began to flicker. A new layer appeared, tiny symbols, like cryptic glyphs, blinking along the web of connections. They felt ancient and alien, as though some long-forgotten language was speaking through the sterile glow of a computer screen. A sudden chill ran through the room, though the heat was stifling just moments before. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grasp. The corridor behind me stretched endlessly, swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed to pulse with intent. The hum of the ventilation was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. I swallowed hard, fighting the rising tide of panic. The building was alive. It was watching. And it was drawing me deeper into something I could neither understand nor escape. The screen blinked again, and the coordinates shifted, closer now, zooming in on a single location. A forgotten town miles away, swallowed by forests and silence. The blinking glyphs flashed in a sequence, almost like a message, but the code eluded me. I felt drawn to it, compelled as though the building itself was pulling me toward this distant place. Then, the power flickered. The screen went black. Silence crushed the space around me. And then, from the darkness, a whisper. Not human. Not quite sound. A low vibration, a voice felt more than heard, reverberating through the walls and deep into my bones. Come. My heart thundered, the tremor in my hand a raging storm. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee into the night. But I was rooted, held fast by the building's unseen grasp. I had crossed a threshold. The tower was no longer just a place, it was a gate, a beacon to things best left forgotten. As the emergency lights sputtered back to life, casting a sickly red glow over peeling paint and broken tiles, I realized the truth. This was not a building abandoned by men. It was a sentinel. A keeper of secrets older than the city itself. And now, it had marked me. Marcus's breath hitched as the sickly red emergency lights bathed the empty corridors. The whispered call lingered in the air, a spectral invitation that clawed at his sanity. With trembling hands, he forced himself forward, each step weighted by dread but propelled by an unyielding need to understand. He navigated the maze of hallways, their familiar shapes now distorted into a labyrinth of shadows. Walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of some great, slumbering beast. At the far end of the 15th floor, a heavy door, once marked simply, storage, now stood cracked open, revealing a stairwell plunging into darkness below. The cold air that seeped out was unlike anything he had felt in the building before. It carried whispers, half-heard voices speaking in tongues older than time, and a scent, like burnt paper and forgotten memories. Marcus hesitated. The rational part of his mind screamed to turn back, but the other voice, the one that had drawn him to the coordinates, urged him onward. Descending into the abyss, the stairwell walls closed in tighter, the air thick with a presence pressing close, unseen but palpably near. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, not matching his own rhythm, always just out of sync. His flashlight flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced and twisted on the concrete walls. At the bottom, the narrow hallway stretched into a vault-like chamber lined with monitors, each displaying different segments of the global map, all pulsing with the same cryptic glyphs. In the center stood a console, wires snaking like veins into the floor, humming with a low mechanical heartbeat. Marcus approached, drawn by a mixture of terror and fascination. On the console's screen, a countdown began, numbers ticking down with cold precision. He had no idea what would happen when it reached zero, but the building seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if holding its breath. His hand hovered over the console, trembling. Suddenly, a voice, clear and sharp, echoed through the chamber, a voice that was neither human nor machine, but something ancient and omnipresent. You are chosen, Marcus. The network awakens. The cycle begins anew. The room shuddered, the monitors blurring into a whirlpool of images, ghostly faces, places lost to time, and secrets buried deep beneath earth and steel. And in that moment, Marcus understood the terrifying truth: the Meridian Tower was no mere building. It was a gateway, a beacon connecting realities, weaving a web across time and space, and he was now ensnared in its sinister design. The chamber's cold hum reverberated through Marcus's bones as the countdown dissolved into a steady pulse, like a heartbeat syncing with his own. The monitors flickered, shifting images morphing into visions not confined by earthly logic. Ghostly landscapes bled into one another, constellations rearranged themselves in impossible geometries, and symbols danced like living fire across the screens. A voice, both distant and intimate, whispered through the space, not spoken words but a transmission felt directly in his mind. You stand at the nexus, Marcus. A conduit between what was, what is, and what might be. The walls around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by swirling vistas of stars and shadow. Time folded and unfolded, revealing fragments of forgotten history, ancient civilizations rising and falling beneath skies that gleamed with unfamiliar constellations. The coordinates on the spreadsheets were not merely places, but echoes of events where the fabric of reality had thinned, where the tower's reach had pierced the veil between worlds. Images flickered, a city swallowed by darkness, a spectral procession in a moonlit forest, a lighthouse blinking in a storm that raged beyond any earthly tempest. Each event bore the same signature: disappearance, silence, and the cold trace of something watching from beyond. Marcus's heartbeat quickened, a mix of awe and dread coursing through his veins. He felt himself pulled forward, not by feet but by something deeper, a cosmic current threading through the marrow of the tower itself. His body was still, but his consciousness was traveling, slipping across the lattice of space and time woven by the tower's ancient design. Suddenly, he stood amid the ruins of a forgotten temple, the stone walls etched with the same cryptic glyphs from the monitors. The air was thick with incense and the whisper of prayers long silenced. He could feel eyes upon him, watchers from beyond the physical realm, ancient guardians, or watchers waiting for the next cycle to unfold. A presence approached, not threatening, but profound and inscrutable. It spoke without words, sending impressions directly into his mind, cycles of destruction and rebirth, the endless dance of light and shadow, the balance maintained by the tower's silent vigil. Marcus realized then that the Meridian Tower was a focal point, a bridge linking worlds, timelines, and dimensions. It catalogued these moments where reality itself faltered, capturing coordinates as a map of cosmic fractures. And he was no accident. He was chosen as the keeper's witness, tasked with guarding the knowledge, bearing the burden of truth too heavy for most to bear. Yet with this revelation came a chilling question: what price must he pay for this forbidden awareness? And how long before the tower demanded more than observation, demanded action? The oppressive red glow washed over everything, transforming the familiar office into a hellscape of shadows. My heartbeat pounded in sync with the pulsing red pin on the screen, the label flashing coldly: subject acquired. Anomaly designation MW Dariora 1. Containment protocols activated. The building itself seemed to shudder beneath me, a vibration that settled deep in my bones, as if the very foundation was alive and aware. Suddenly, emergency lights snapped on throughout the tower, bathing the space in an unholy crimson that fractured my shadow into something monstrous and unfamiliar. The soundscape around me shifted, locks engaging with sharp metallic clicks, ventilation fans ramping up to deafening speeds, and somewhere distant, the grinding of colossal mechanical doors sealing shut. Panic propelled me toward the stairwell, each step echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating hallway, but the door refused to budge. I pounded on it, the handle wouldn't turn. Desperate, I jabbed at the elevator buttons, but they remained dark and unresponsive. The building had sealed me inside, a trap laid by an intelligence cataloging disasters and anomalies across the world. The horrifying truth slammed into me: I wasn't merely an observer. I had become part of the phenomenon. My reflection flickered in the dark window panes, wide, terrified eyes, pale skin slick with sweat, hands trembling uncontrollably as I struggled to keep my phone steady. Behind my trembling image, shadows twisted and shifted, forms that should not exist, hovering 20 floors above the empty streets below. A deep harmonic tone began to emanate from the computers, weaving together into a complex resonance that vibrated deep inside my chest. The sound was no longer heard by my ears, it bypassed them entirely, reverberating through my skull, rattling my brain itself. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the dissonance persisted, growing louder, layering frequencies beyond human comprehension. Amidst the roaring vibration, another sound emerged: footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried footsteps in the corridor just beyond the office door. Unlike my own footsteps, these carried no echo. They were coming closer. My breath hitched as I understood with terrifying clarity, whatever had been watching me all this time was finally ready to reveal itself. I grabbed the only weapon within reach, a heavy glass paperweight, its cold weight a faint comfort in my shaking hands. Adrenaline surged, but my fight-or-flight instincts collided, leaving me frozen, paralyzed with raw, searing terror. The footsteps halted. The door handle began to turn. In that heartbeat before the door opened, a memory surfaced from my research, an obscure report from Prague. A security guard vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances, his last log entry eerily resembling mine, his own name and coordinates. Weeks later, he was found wandering, empty-eyed and mute except for repeating coordinates that heralded new anomalies. The door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, not fully human, yet wearing my face, my frame, my clothes. But something was grotesquely wrong. The eyes were impossibly large, luminescent with an ancient, vast intelligence that chilled me to the core. The figure spoke, using my voice, but the words were foreign, coming from a place beyond. The network requires expansion, it intoned, stepping into the room with movements almost, but not quite, natural. You have served your purpose well, Marcus Webb. Your coordinates have been logged. Your replacement has been prepared. I understood, horrifyingly, that this was what I would become, or what would replace me when the process completed. This entity wore my identity like a mask, an ill-fitting suit, poised to step out into the world carrying my life, while I faded away, lost, like the guard before me. The glass paperweight felt heavy, almost unbearably so, in my trembling hands. The imposter's eyes, those unnatural, glowing orbs, locked onto mine with a piercing intensity that stripped away every shred of resistance. Its voice, eerily calm and devoid of empathy, echoed in the room as though layered with centuries of cold calculation. You are the catalyst, Marcus. The network thrives on those who awaken to its truth. Soon, your essence will be assimilated, your consciousness archived within the lattice. Fear is irrelevant. I barely managed to whisper, what happens to me? A cruel smile twisted the entity's lips, a mimicry of human expression yet soulless. You will become a memory, a coordinate in the endless cycle. Your place will be taken, your role fulfilled. The tower is eternal. You are transient. The office seemed to close in, the walls breathing with a sinister pulse. My vision blurred as dizziness overtook me. The sound, a low, pervasive hum, grew louder until it drowned out all thought. I dropped the paperweight, its shatter muted beneath the cacophony. Suddenly, the room dissolved. I was pulled through darkness, a tunnel of stars and fractured light. Faces flickered past, lost souls, guardians, watchers, each bearing the weight of countless cycles. Whispers brushed against my mind, warnings, secrets, the weight of eons. And then, clarity. I understood the tower's purpose, a sentinel standing at the nexus of realities, balancing light and shadow, life and oblivion. It gathered those marked by fate, those who glimpsed the cosmic threads, and wove them into its eternal design. But in that weaving, individuality was lost. I felt my sense of self unraveling, replaced by something vast and collective. Yet, within the infinite web, a spark remained, a flicker of defiance. I am not just a coordinate. I am more. And somewhere deep within the cosmic weave, I vowed to fight, not just for myself, but for all who would be swallowed by the tower's shadow. The city breathed around me, a pulse of lights and movement that felt both familiar and profoundly alien. I walked the streets wearing Marcus Webb's face, a mask perfectly molded but hollow beneath the surface. Each step echoed with the weight of a borrowed life, a life mapped, catalogued, and now commandeered by the tower's insatiable will. I felt his memories like fragile ghosts, flashes of warmth, fear, and fleeting hope, but they were distant, overlaid by something older, deeper, and colder. An ancient intelligence hummed beneath my skin, a network stretching beyond time and space, binding me to coordinates unseen and unfathomable. Voices whispered at the edge of my consciousness, fragments of conversations I was never meant to hear, reports of disappearances, anomalies pulsing at the edges of reality, signals crackling from places long forgotten. The tower's web wove me in, making me both observer and instrument. As I moved through Marcus's life, touching his belongings, speaking in his voice, I became a vessel for expansion. Each interaction rippled through the network, extending the tower's reach further into the living world. Yet beneath the veneer of control, a flicker of something else stirred, an echo of humanity resisting the dark tide. I sensed the struggle, faint but persistent, like a candle flickering against an encroaching shadow. I was both him and not him. The old Marcus, lost in the tower's endless weave. And this new self, an emissary of the network, walking among the living, carrying a mission too vast to comprehend. And so, the cycle continued. The heavy weight of the glass paperweight seemed to anchor my very soul as it rested in my trembling grasp. Time was slipping through my fingers, and I knew, this was my last chance to defy the transformation that sought to consume me. The reinforced windows loomed behind me, a fragile barrier between salvation and oblivion. 20 floors below awaited the unforgiving pavement, a desperate gamble against the building's relentless grip. Summoning every ounce of strength, I hurled the paperweight at the massive window. The glass webbed with cracks but stubbornly refused to shatter. The entity wearing my face smiled, a cruel, patient smile that chilled me deeper than the cold night air. "That will not work," it intoned, advancing with slow, measured steps. "The building provides. The building protects. The building expands." But I had seen a flaw it had overlooked, or dismissed. The window's integrity was compromised. The building's pressurization system strained to compensate, creating a pressure difference that bowed the damaged glass outward like a trembling membrane. With reckless desperation, I charged, slamming my shoulder into the fragile pane. The glass held for a heartbeat, then exploded outward in a dazzling cascade of glittering shards. The night wind roared up from the street below, stealing my breath, lifting me momentarily from the building's malevolent embrace. I was flying, suspended between the twisted metal and unforgiving earth. But gravity was a cruel ally. My jacket caught on architectural details and window ledges, arresting my fall enough that when I crashed onto the 12th floor setback, battered and bleeding, I was still alive. Lying there gasping, I looked upward at the hole I'd torn 20 floors above. The entity's face appeared in the broken window, my face, unreadable and cold. After a moment's silence, it stepped back into the tower's shadowed interior, vanishing as sirens pierced the night. Someone had called for help. Soon paramedics and police would swarm, demanding answers I did not have. How could I explain this nightmare without sounding mad? Then, as I waited for rescue, my phone, silent all along inside the tower, buzzed alive with full signal. 17 missed calls. Dozens of texts. All from unknown numbers. Each message carried coordinates and timestamps, locations worldwide where new anomalies stirred. I was not free. I had become a mobile node in the network's dark expansion. The last message came from my own number, sent while trapped inside. It bore coordinates matching my current broken form and a timestamp 5 minutes ahead. My escape was no escape at all. The building had released me because it no longer needed me trapped inside. It needed me outside, carrying its creeping influence. Free, yet never safe. And somewhere in the darkness above, something wore my face, settling into my job, ready to log the next coordinates as the network spread inexorably across the globe. The British phone booth stood quietly in my backyard, a relic from another era cloaked in the soft, forgiving light of dawn. Its red paint had long faded to the dusty hue of dried blood, and the glass panels were fractured with spiderweb cracks that caught the morning sun like shards of forgotten memories. To any passerby, it was nothing more than an old, forgotten artifact, but to me, it was a symbol of a past I was desperate to hold on to. I had been collecting antiques for over 15 years, ever since my divorce left me wandering through a house too large and too empty for just one. The phone booth was my pride and my sanctuary, a crown jewel acquired from an estate sale in Connecticut. The man who sold it to me seemed eager, almost desperate, to part with it. His hand trembled as he handed over the deed, but I was a collector hardened by years of superstition and whispered warnings. I dismissed it all as the nervousness of a man letting go. That night, when I decided to test the booth's long-unused rotary dial, I felt a chill creep down my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. As I lifted the receiver, a faint static hissed, and through the crackling white noise, I heard it, a voice whispering in a language I did not understand, layered beneath the faint ringing tone. Curiosity overcame caution. I pressed my ear closer and the voice grew clearer, repeating a string of numbers and coordinates that sent a cold knot twisting in my stomach. The coordinates led to locations far from here, places tied to unexplained disappearances, strange lights, and whispered legends of things slipping between worlds. That was when the phone booth seemed to hum, almost alive beneath my fingers. The fractured glass reflected my face warped by unease. I realized then that the phone booth wasn't merely a forgotten relic, it was a node, a silent sentinel in the network, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. The past was never truly gone. It lingered, waiting, watching. And I had just stepped into its shadow. The British phone booth stood quietly in my backyard, a relic from another era cloaked in the soft, forgiving light of dawn. Its red paint had long faded to the dusty hue of dried blood, and the glass panels were fractured with spiderweb cracks that caught the morning sun like shards of forgotten memories. To any passerby, it was nothing more than an old, forgotten artifact, but to me, it was a symbol of a past I was desperate to hold on to. I had been collecting antiques for over 15 years, ever since my divorce left me wandering through a house too large and too empty for just one. The phone booth was my pride and my sanctuary, a crown jewel acquired from an estate sale in Connecticut. The man who sold it to me seemed eager, almost desperate, to part with it. His hand trembled as he handed over the deed, but I was a collector hardened by years of superstition and whispered warnings. I dismissed it all as the nervousness of a man letting go. That night, when I decided to test the booth's long-unused rotary dial, I felt a chill creep down my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. As I lifted the receiver, a faint static hissed, and through the crackling white noise, I heard it, a voice whispering in a language I did not understand, layered beneath the faint ringing tone. Curiosity overcame caution. I pressed my ear closer and the voice grew clearer, repeating a string of numbers and coordinates that sent a cold knot twisting in my stomach. The coordinates led to locations far from here, places tied to unexplained disappearances, strange lights, and whispered legends of things slipping between worlds. That was when the phone booth seemed to hum, almost alive beneath my fingers. The fractured glass reflected my face warped by unease. I realized then that the phone booth wasn't merely a forgotten relic, it was a node, a silent sentinel in the network, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. The past was never truly gone. It lingered, waiting, watching. And I had just stepped into its shadow. Beneath the cracked glass and faded red paint, the phone booth pulsed with an eerie life, its silent hum a heartbeat tethered to realms beyond understanding. For the collector, what began as a nostalgic treasure soon became a conduit to a world unseen, a web of whispers, shadows, and secrets that threaded through the coordinates etched in the whispers of the booth's static. At first, the messages came as fleeting fragments, numbers and symbols flickering in his dreams, the soft murmur of voices slipping through the receiver late at night, speaking in riddles and half-remembered languages. Each coordinate was a pinprick on an invisible map, marking places where the veil between worlds thinned, where reality trembled on the edge of something other. With every whispered number, the collector felt himself drawn deeper into the network's embrace. Objects in his home shifted subtly, shadows moved with a will of their own, antique clocks ticked backwards for moments before righting themselves, and the air around the phone booth carried an almost imperceptible vibration, as if it breathed with a restless spirit. He began to map the coordinates obsessively, cross-referencing old news reports, folklore, and obscure archives. The places marked by the phone booth's cryptic messages were sites of unexplained vanishings, spectral sightings, and moments when time seemed to warp, where people and things slipped between worlds and were never quite seen again. The network whispered promises and threats in equal measure, insinuating that knowledge came at a cost. The collector's nights grew restless, haunted by visions of the vanished, pale faces pressed against windows, distant cries carried on the wind, and an endless spiral of turning numbers that seemed to count down to an unseen reckoning. With every new message, the boundary between his waking life and the network's shadowy realm blurred. Friends noticed his growing distance, his distracted gaze, and the way he sometimes murmured coordinates under his breath. Yet, no one could see what tethered him, what pulled at his soul like an unseen hand. The collector understood, deep down, that the phone booth was no mere artifact, it was a sentinel, a node in a vast, cosmic web. And now, so was he. The installation took 3 long days. Miguel, my contractor, spent most of that time muttering in Spanish as he painstakingly connected the electrical wiring. The phone booth demanded its own dedicated line, something I'd arranged purely for authenticity's sake. Inside, the original rotary phone gleamed with a brass glow, despite the decades it had weathered. Miguel tested the connection before leaving, giving a curt nod as he confirmed the dial tone. That first night, I sat in my kitchen nursing a whiskey, my gaze drifting to the booth framed in the backyard by floodlights. Against the dark autumn sky, it looked like a museum piece, out of place and timeless. A warm satisfaction swelled in my chest, mingling with the burn of the alcohol. Finally, I had something to fill the emptiness that had grown since Margaret left. Then, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the phone rang. My heart slammed against my ribs, wrenching me awake. The bedroom was dark, the green digits of my bedside clock casting eerie light across the ceiling. But the ringing wasn't inside the house, it came from outside, from the booth. That unmistakable double ring of an old British telephone echoed across the backyard, sharp and urgent like a fire bell tolling in a morgue. My feet hit the cold hardwood before my mind could catch up. I stumbled to the window and pressed my face to the glass. The booth stood illuminated in the floodlights, the cracked glass panels trembling as the black handset vibrated with each ring. By the time I threw on a robe and reached the booth, the ringing had stopped. The October air bit through my thin fabric, raising goosebumps as I approached. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, an unnaturally loud sound in the still pre-dawn quiet. Inside, the handset hung motionless on its silver hook, silent as death. I lifted the receiver, pressing it to my ear. The dial tone hummed steady and true, but beneath that electronic drone, I swore I heard something else, something breathing, whispering static that might have been wind or nothing at all. Sleep wouldn't come easily that night. I lay awake, eyes tracing the ceiling, telling myself old phones sometimes hiccuped, crossed wires, electrical interference, routine testing by the phone company. A dozen rational explanations, but rationality felt thin when darkness pressed against my windows like curious fingers. The next day brought crisp sunlight and the bustle of normal life. I catalogued a recent acquisition, a Victorian music box with a dancing ballerina, her chipped paint revealing a fragile metal skeleton beneath. Work had always been my refuge, the careful preservation of the past offering purpose where relationships failed. Around noon, I called the phone company to report the mysterious ringing. The technician sounded bored, explaining new installations sometimes experienced hiccups, promising to send someone within the week. That evening, I decided to test the phone myself. The booth smelled of brass polish and old wood tinged with something else, something organic and sour, like flowers left too long in water. I dialed my own cell phone, listening as it rang inside the house while I stood inside the booth. The connection was clear, surprisingly crisp for such an ancient device. I hung up, satisfied. Then I noticed the scratches on the interior wall. Thin, fresh lines carved into the red paint, tally marks, sharp and raw. Running my fingers over them, I felt the edges where something had gouged the surface. At 2:43 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, I was ready. I'd left my robe at the foot of the bed and positioned a flashlight on the nightstand. The ringing was louder, more insistent, each double ring screaming for attention. Within 30 seconds, I was outside, crossing the wet grass toward the booth. The tally marks etched into the faded red paint gnawed at my mind like an open wound. Their sharp edges seemed to catch the faint glow of the flashlight as I traced each line carefully, the metal beneath shining like a secret waiting to be revealed. They weren't random scratches, they were deliberate, purposeful, and deeply unsettling. I wondered who, or what, had marked the booth in such a way. Each mark felt like a silent tally of time, a record of unseen visits or unspoken warnings. The booth was more than a relic, it was a ledger, a silent witness to something beyond my understanding. That night, as the ringing ceased and the chill settled in, I found myself unable to look away from the scratches. I took photos, zooming in on the fine grooves, hoping to capture details invisible to the naked eye. Through the lens, the lines seemed to shift, forming patterns, subtle curves that suggested something more than mere tallying. In the days that followed, the tally marks multiplied. New scratches appeared overnight, precise and fresh, as if an invisible hand was counting down, or counting up, to an unknown event. I scoured forums and occult archives, searching for similar markings or symbols linked to phone booths, portals, or liminal spaces. References were scarce but chilling, ancient runes carved into doorways, marks left by watchers, signs of passage between worlds. Each thread of research pulled me deeper into the network's grip. The tally marks were a code, a message written in silence, counting the steps between realities. One evening, I found a worn journal tucked beneath the booth's floorboards during a cleaning. Its pages were brittle, filled with cryptic notes and sketches of glyphs resembling the tally marks. The author spoke of watchers, entities that moved unseen between places marked by coordinates. They recorded the passage of time and souls, keeping balance in the hidden folds of existence. As the booth's tally marks grew, so did the whispers. The static in the receiver now carried voices speaking in tongues I could almost understand. They spoke of cycles ending, doors opening, and the thin places where the network's influence seeped into our world. The booth was no longer just an artifact. It was a beacon, a warning, and perhaps a trap. And I was caught in its unfolding mystery. The tally marks on the booth's cracked red paint seemed to multiply with every passing night, their sinister presence carving unease deep into my bones. I knew I had to find a way to sever the growing tether binding me to that cursed relic. The booth's whispers had begun invading my waking hours, fracturing my grip on reality. If I didn't act soon, I feared I would become another lost coordinate in its expanding network. My first step was to disconnect the booth's power source. I waited until dusk, when the fading light seemed to thin the veil between worlds, and made my way to the breaker panel. The wires hummed faintly even before I touched the switch, a low vibration that seemed to resist interruption. With a firm grip, I flipped the breaker, plunging the booth into darkness. But the silence was deceptive. That night, the ringing began anew, louder and more insistent, echoing through the empty house. The tally marks had deepened, now glowing faintly under the moonlight like scars alive with purpose. Desperation pushed me to remove the handset entirely. Its cord seemed to writhe in my hands, as if alive, unwilling to be severed. Even without the receiver, the booth pulsed with energy, the tally marks seeming to stretch across the paint like creeping veins. I sought help, paranormal investigators, historians, anyone who might understand the booth's dark nature. But their warnings only deepened my dread. The booth was a nexus, a gateway not meant to be disturbed. Attempts to contain it might accelerate its influence. I tried cleansing rituals, smudging with sage, sprinkling salt around its base, but the tally marks resisted, untouched and ominous. One morning, I found new scratches carved deeply into my own skin, thin, jagged lines that matched the booth's cryptic tally. Fear and exhaustion clouded my thoughts, but surrender was not an option. I began to document everything, each ring, every whisper, the spreading tally marks, hoping to decode the message before it was too late. The booth's hold tightened, but so did my resolve. To break free from its grasp, I would have to face whatever lurked in the static, whatever watched from beyond the tally marks, and confront the network itself. The night was thick with silence, save for the low hum that emanated from the phone booth, a sound that felt less mechanical and more like a living breath. I stood before it, clutching the worn leather-bound journal I had found beneath its floorboards, the brittle pages filled with cryptic symbols and unsettling warnings. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something deeper compelled me forward, a mix of desperation and stubborn defiance. Determined to sever the connection, I prepared a ritual the journal described, a cleansing not just of place, but of the ties that bound one's soul to the unseen network. The words were archaic, weaving through languages forgotten by time, demanding both precision and courage. With sage smoldering in one hand and a silver dagger in the other, I circled the booth, sprinkling salt in deliberate patterns traced from the glyphs in the journal. The tally marks glowed faintly under the moonlight, pulsing in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. As I chanted the incantations, the whispers in the static grew louder, voices overlapping in a cacophony of warning and rage. The booth vibrated, the ancient wood creaking as if protesting the intrusion. Suddenly, the air shifted, a coldness that seeped into my bones and clutched at my heart. From the shadows beyond the booth, a shape emerged, barely visible yet impossibly vast. Its presence pressed against the edges of reality, a dark sentinel bound to the network's will. The tally marks flashed violently, and I felt their weight press into my skin, a burning that threatened to consume me. But I held firm, the journal's words steadying my trembling voice. "Begone. Release your hold. This soul is free." For a moment, time hung suspended, then the shape recoiled with a terrible wail that shattered the night's silence. The whispers fractured into silence, the tally marks fading to mere scratches once more. Exhausted, I collapsed against the booth, the first breath of freedom tasting bitter and sweet. But I knew this victory was fragile. The network was vast, patient, and relentless. Somewhere beyond the cracked glass, the tally marks would be etched anew, waiting for the next to fall into the web. The booth's interior light flickered erratically as I gripped the handset, the unstable glow casting eerie shadows that danced across the cramped, worn space. Bringing the receiver to my ear, I caught a breath, a rapid, panicked inhalation, unmistakably human. A woman's voice crackled through the static, distant yet piercing, one word, desperate, help. My throat tightened. I barely managed a hoarse whisper, asking who she was, what she needed. Her voice came again, clearer now, urgent and fractured, speaking of being lost, swallowed by darkness, terrified and alone. She gave me a name, Patricia Rise, and an address on Maple Street before the line abruptly died. Frozen, I stood in the booth for minutes, the receiver heavy in my trembling hand. Rational explanations tumbled through my mind, prank call, crossed lines, interference, a recorded message. Yet the raw desperation, the unmistakable terror in that voice was undeniable. Back inside, I fired up my laptop, searching for Patricia Hendricks of Maple Street. The results froze my blood. Patricia Hendricks, 32 years old, vanished on October 15, 1967. Last seen leaving her downtown department store job, never found. Her car abandoned 3 days later with keys in the ignition and purse untouched. The date hit me like a blow, October 15, 1967. Exactly 58 years ago to the day. The night stretched on with me pacing, sipping bitter coffee that tasted like ash, grasping for logic. Coincidence, I told myself. An elaborate prank rooted in historical records. But the haunting urgency of her voice lingered. Night after night, the calls came between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., each brief, each ending with a plea for help and identification. Research revealed a chilling pattern: every caller vanished decades prior, on the very date they called. Robert Chen, missing October 18, 1973, Maria Santos, disappeared October 21, 1982, Thomas Wright, gone October 24, 1995. Names and faces lost to time, all within a 5-mile radius of where the booth now stood. Each disappearance a silent erasure, a mystery left unsolved. And now, they were reaching out, through impossible gulfs of time and space, via a phone booth that should never have received their calls. By the fourth night, my hands trembled uncontrollably. Coffee lost its power. Meals became forgotten, replaced by crackers and cold dread. The tally marks inside the booth multiplied, sprawling in intricate patterns, pulsing faintly beneath the flickering light. In a desperate call, I questioned Miguel about the installation. His tone shifted, grave as he revealed the booth was linked to a phone number once assigned to the local police department in the 1960s, a number deactivated, then recycled through the phone system decades later. Driven, I delved into library archives and police records, chasing fragments of cold cases and fading headlines. The pattern emerged like a dark tapestry, decades of missing persons, all within that narrow radius, all tied to the dates echoing through those ghostly calls. The booth was not a relic, it was a beacon. A nexus where time frayed, where the lost whispered through the veil, seeking to be heard. And I was its unwitting listener. The more I dove into the records, the heavier the weight on my chest became. Each faded newspaper clipping, each grainy photograph, was a thread pulling me deeper into a tapestry of loss and mystery I couldn't escape. The disappearances weren't random, they traced a chilling arc through the neighborhood around my home, a pattern as deliberate as the tally marks carved into the booth's paint. I began visiting the sites, the parking lots, alleyways, and street corners where the missing had last been seen. Most had changed beyond recognition, swallowed by time and development. But in the shifting shadows of twilight, I felt a familiar unease settle like a cloak. One night, at the edge of Maple Street, I stood where Patricia Hendricks had vanished. The air was unnaturally still, the street lamp casting long, wavering shadows. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft, hesitant, retreating. I wasn't alone. I interviewed neighbors and local historians, piecing together stories and whispered legends. An old woman remembered strange lights flickering near the phone booth decades ago. A retired cop spoke of cold cases dismissed as hopeless, cases marked by odd details that never made it into reports, glimpses of shadows where no one should be, voices caught on radios that no one claimed. One evening, I returned to the booth, notebook in hand. As I traced the tally marks again, a sudden chill washed over me. The scratches seemed to shimmer under my fingertips, as if alive. I heard the ringing before I saw the handset move, slowly, almost deliberately, as if beckoning. With a trembling hand, I lifted the receiver. The voice that came through was faint, distant, but unmistakably real. "Help me," it whispered, the same desperate plea I'd heard before. I knew then that these weren't just calls. They were echoes, trapped souls reaching across time, caught in the network's web. And the phone booth was their tether to this world, a fragile bridge between past and present. Determined to find answers, I began digging into local archives, searching for anything connecting the phone booth itself to these mysteries. What I uncovered was chilling. The booth had been relocated several times before arriving in my yard, each site linked to a string of disappearances and unexplained phenomena. The booth wasn't merely a witness, it was an active participant. With every new piece, the lines blurred between reality and something far darker. And I realized, uncovering the truth might cost me everything. The deeper I sank into the mystery, the more the phone booth consumed my life. Nights blurred into days as I obsessively pieced together fragmented clues, the tally marks inside the booth multiplying like a malignant heartbeat counting down some unknown reckoning. Friends stopped calling, their voices fading like ghosts themselves. I barely noticed. Their absence was swallowed by the persistent whisper of the booth static, the endless stream of calls from the lost, and the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. Sleep became a stranger. When I did drift into fitful rest, nightmares chased me, shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edges of vision, endless corridors folding into themselves, voices calling my name in desperate, fractured echoes. I woke drenched in sweat, clutching the journal, the tally marks etched into my skin in my dreams. My health faltered. Meals were skipped or forgotten, coffee turned to a bitter ritual sustaining me through sleepless nights. My hands trembled with exhaustion and fear, fingers stained with ink and salt from hours of frantic note-taking in salt circles drawn around the booth's base in desperate hope. I isolated myself, pushing away the few who reached out. Their concern felt like a distant echo, muffled beneath the booth's relentless call. It was no longer just an object in my backyard, it was a living, breathing presence tethering me to a realm I could neither see nor fully comprehend. One evening, I found myself standing outside the booth under a slivered moon, rain slick on the cracked paint. The tally marks glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing with an otherworldly light that seemed to sync with my ragged heartbeat. I realized then that I had become part of the network cycle, both observer and participant, tethered irrevocably. I made sacrifices, my career, friendships, peace of mind, all surrendered at the altar of obsession. The price was steep, but the truth called too loud to ignore. And yet, despite the toll, I could not turn away. For in the heart of the booth's silent tally lay a secret that, once uncovered, might tear the veil between worlds, or destroy what remained of my own. Night after night, the whispers grew louder, haunting murmurs woven into the static that clung to the edges of my consciousness. The tally marks inside the booth multiplied relentlessly, their faint glow carving spectral lines into the darkness. My reflection, once familiar, became a stranger's visage etched with exhaustion and dread. One evening, as rain hammered the cracked glass and the wind moaned like a lost soul, I stood before the booth, trembling and hollow. My hands shook so violently I could barely lift the receiver. The latest call had been worse than all before, a voice pleading, fragmented by fear and desperation, begging for release from a darkness I could not grasp. The boundaries between waking and dreaming blurred. Faces flickered at the periphery of my vision, silent witnesses from forgotten times, their eyes hollow, searching. I found myself retreating from the world, retreating into the booth's cold embrace as if it were both prison and sanctuary. One night, sleep abandoned me entirely. The tally marks pulsed violently, each beat syncing with the hammering of my heart. I felt an unbearable pressure building inside my chest, a crushing weight that squeezed until my vision blurred and my knees buckled. I collapsed against the booth, sweat mingling with rain, breath ragged and shallow. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, voices overlapping in a torrent of agony and warning. The booth's light flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed like living things. In that fractured moment, I understood, I was breaking. Not just in body or mind, but at the very core of my being. The network was fracturing me, pulling me apart to weave me into its endless web. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered into the storm, enough. Let me go. Silence fell suddenly. The rain ceased. The booth's glow faded to darkness. But I knew, freedom was an illusion. The tally marks would never stop. The network would never release me. And as the night swallowed me whole, I realized the terrible truth, I was lost. The booth's dark history loomed heavy in my mind as I uncovered its chilling past. Patricia Hendricks's disappearance in 1967 had been intimately tied to that very booth. Police had traced her last known location to a desperate phone call she'd made from inside it, reporting car trouble and begging for help. By the time officers arrived, they found nothing but her abandoned purse lying beside the open door and deep claw marks etched into the booth's interior walls, signs of a frantic attempt to escape some unseen terror. The booth had changed hands many times over the decades, moved from place to place as municipal property was redistributed. Yet everywhere it traveled, the pattern repeated, people vanished. The same desperate phone calls echoed through time, answered only by silence, followed by fresh scratches on the booth's walls. It became clear to me, I wasn't receiving calls from the past. I was receiving pleas from souls trapped in an impossible limbo, suspended between moments, their last cries for salvation bouncing endlessly through a conduit soaked in their suffering. On the seventh night, overwhelmed and terrified, I made a choice that haunts me still. When the phone rang at precisely 3:33 a.m., instead of answering, I disconnected the line completely. With trembling hands, I pulled the wire from its junction box, wrenching it free with a force born from desperation. The ringing ceased instantly, swallowed by a silence so profound it pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. But then, something worse arose, frantic scratching from within the booth, as if dozens of invisible hands clawed at the walls, desperate to break free. I bolted back inside, locking every door and window, drawing curtains over glass that suddenly felt as fragile as tissue. From my bedroom window, I watched the booth stand dark and silent in the backyard, no longer bathed in floodlights I was too afraid to turn on. The scratching continued through the night, a tormenting sound like nails dragged across wood, seeming to emanate from the very walls of my house. When dawn finally broke, the booth was unchanged, but the grass circling its base had died, brown and withered as if some malevolent force had sucked the life from the earth itself. That afternoon, I put the house on the market. The booth was sold to a scrap dealer who promised it would be destroyed, melted down, recycled, rendered harmless. From my kitchen window, I watched the workers load it onto a truck. They seemed eager to finish and leave. 3 months later, in a new city, new home, and new life, I clung to the fragile certainty that some antiques belong buried in the past. Yet in the dark, sleepless hours, I sometimes hear a distant phone ringing, calling to me. The tally marks have followed me too. Thin, neat lines appeared etched on my bedroom wall the morning after I moved in, silent reminders that some connections, once made, can never truly be severed. The phone company informed me my new number once belonged to a police station closed decades ago. Now, I sleep with the lights on. Story 3. The scent of old film stock and spilled soda had become my constant companion. For 23 years, I fed reels through the ancient projectors at the Orpheum Theater, immersed in the mechanical ballet of sprockets and gates, the hypnotic whisper of celluloid sliding past the aperture. But lately, something changed. The rhythm of those late-night screenings shifted, turning the familiar into a maze of shadows and impossibilities. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday in October during the 11:30 p.m. showing of a Hitchcock classic. I manned the projection booth for the graveyard shift, trusted by the theater's owner because I never caused trouble, never asked for raises, and showed up through any storm. The crowd was peculiar after midnight, insomniacs, late-shift workers, and the occasional film student chasing cinema's hidden gems. The clock in the projection booth ticked steadily, its rhythmic pulse the only companion in the dimly lit space. Outside, the worn velvet seats of the Orpheum Theater sat mostly empty, save for a handful of late-night patrons whose eyes glistened with a mixture of fatigue and fascination. The reel spun smoothly, the familiar click of the sprockets and the flickering light painting shadows that danced across the ceiling and walls. But as the minutes wore on, subtle shifts began to ripple through the atmosphere. The screen flickered not with the usual grain and static, but with brief glimpses of something else, images that did not belong to the film. Faces appeared, pale and fleeting, etched with sorrow and silent pleas. Shadows moved just beyond the frame, shapes that melted into darkness whenever one tried to focus. At first, I dismissed these intrusions as tired eyes playing tricks, the result of countless sleepless nights and endless reels. But the theater itself seemed to breathe differently, an ancient presence lurking in the air, thickening the silence between scenes. One night, as I threaded a new reel, the projector shutter jammed briefly, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden absence of light was suffocating. When the image returned, it wasn't the Hitchcock film I'd loaded but a grainy black and white sequence of a man wandering a desolate street, his face obscured by shadow. The reel continued playing scenes I'd never seen, moments that felt disjointed, like memories not my own. The man's footsteps echoed through the empty streets, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep from the film itself. I reached to stop the projector, but the controls were unresponsive, as if the machine had taken on a will of its own. The room grew colder, the air heavy with something ancient and watchful. Suddenly, a voice whispered through the static, soft, urgent, barely audible. It called my name. I froze. The reel spun faster, the images blurring into a vortex of light and shadow. When the projector finally stopped, the theater was silent once more, but I knew something had changed. The Orpheum was no longer just a theater. It was a threshold. And I was trapped on the edge. The chill in the projection booth deepened, seeping into my bones like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. The film reel sat silently, its edges humming faintly in the dark. My hands trembled as I reached out, unsure whether to rewind or to press play again. The voices, whispering my name, still echoed softly in the air, intertwining with the mechanical heartbeat of the projector. I needed answers. I started scouring the theater's archives, hidden away in dusty cabinets beneath layers of cobwebs and forgotten receipts. There, tucked between faded playbills and yellowed photographs, I found a worn journal belonging to a previous projectionist from decades ago. The entry spoke of strange occurrences eerily similar to my own, unexplained shadows, distorted footage, and a mysterious film reel that appeared unbidden on the projector. The journal's final entry chilled me to the core. The film is alive. It shows not what was filmed, but what must be seen. It calls to those who watch, binding their souls to its endless story. With growing dread, I realized the reel wasn't just footage, it was a message, a doorway into something ancient and unfathomable. The man in the shadowed street wasn't merely a figure on film, he was a herald, a guide through layers of forgotten time and hidden worlds. Each screening pulled me deeper into the theater's secret, blurring the line between reality and illusion. Patrons reported fleeting glimpses of figures in the aisles, whispers in empty rows, and cold drafts that whispered of forgotten sorrow. I was no longer just a projectionist, I had become a guardian of a threshold, charged with unraveling the theater's haunted past and confronting the darkness bleeding through its reels. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the projector whirred to life on its own. The screen flickered, and the man from the mysterious film stepped forward, no longer confined to celluloid but emerging into the flickering shadows around me. The threshold had been crossed. The air grew cold and thick, pressing against me like the weight of unseen eyes. The man in the flickering light, no longer confined to the grainy screen, stepped forward, his form wavering between shadow and substance. His face, obscured before, now revealed glimpses of sorrow etched deep within hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The projector's steady hum faltered, then slowed, as if the very machinery feared what was unfolding. The apparition's gaze locked onto mine, and a flood of images cascaded through my mind, forgotten memories, lost moments frozen in time. I saw the theater's earliest days, laughter turned to silence, dreams swallowed by darkness. He spoke, not in words, but in a resonance that vibrated within my chest. You are the keeper now. The stories, the souls, they bind us all. To watch is to become. Panic surged, but so did a strange clarity. The theater was a vessel, a bridge between worlds, and I stood at its fragile heart. I reached for the journal again, its pages now seeming alive with cryptic markings I hadn't noticed before, symbols pulsing in the dim light, guiding me toward understanding. The man's form flickered violently, then faded like mist, leaving me alone in the booth, heart pounding. Outside, the theater's faded marquee flickered, its letters spelling a single word, remember. I realized then that my nights would never be the same. The projectionist's role was no longer to simply show films, but to guard the stories trapped between frames, to protect the boundary where reality frayed and to face the darkness that lurked beyond the reel. The flickering marquee outside cast eerie shadows that danced like ghosts across the cracked pavement as I stepped out into the cold night air. The word, remember, hung in the darkness, a summons and a warning entwined. My breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale misting into the chill, but my mind raced faster, tangled in questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Inside the projection booth, the journal lay open, its cryptic symbols now pulsing faintly, as if alive. I traced the inked glyphs with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The theater wasn't just haunted, it was a nexus, a thin place where worlds touched, and I had become its unwilling guardian. That night, the theater seemed to shift. Corridors stretched impossibly long, shadows thickened like living things, and the hum of the projector echoed as a distant heartbeat calling me deeper. The audience seats, once empty save for a few night wanderers, whispered with voices just beyond hearing, souls trapped between frames, desperate for release or recognition. I felt them brush against me, a cold touch, a whisper of grief, a faint flicker of hope. They were memories, echoes, remnants of stories never fully told. The apparition had warned me, to watch is to become. I understood now. Every screening, every flicker of light, bound me tighter to this realm, a tether pulling me toward oblivion. But surrender wasn't an option. Armed with the journal's riddles and a resolve born of fear and desperation, I began piecing together the theater's cursed history, tales of vanished patrons, cursed films, and a malevolent force feeding on forgotten stories. One night, as the reel spun with unnatural speed, the shadows coalesced into forms, faces twisted in silent screams, hands reaching from the darkness. The air thickened, suffocating, as the very fabric between worlds tore. I stood my ground, reciting the incantations from the journal, the ancient words burning through the gloom. Light burst from the projector's lens, slicing through the shadows like a blade. The darkness screamed and recoiled, the tether snapping with a violent shudder. Exhausted but alive, I collapsed as dawn crept through the stained glass, painting the theater in muted gold. The battle wasn't over. The forces lurking beyond the reel were patient, eternal. But for now, the boundary held. I was no longer just a projectionist. I was a sentinel. The night air hung heavy as I prepared to load vertigo for the handful of patrons scattered across the threadbare seats below. But my gaze caught an anomaly, an extra canister, nestled beside the familiar reels. It bore no label, no studio markings, just cold, unyielding metal. I hesitated, fingers tracing its icy surface, a chill crawling up my spine like unseen fingers. The weight of the film inside felt unnatural, too dense for standard 35mm stock. Protocol screamed at me to set it aside, consult management come morning. Yet, my hands moved as if possessed, threading the mysterious reel into the secondary projector with mechanical precision. Unease settled in my gut like a stone. As the film flickered to life, my heart hammered so fiercely against my ribs I could hear its echo inside the cramped booth. The screen unfolded images that defied logic. Opening credits rolled over familiar streets, the courthouse square, Main Street, the old bridge spanning Miller's Creek. But these scenes weren't what I knew. Buildings gleamed with unfamiliar architecture, sleek vehicles traversed roads unknown to me, and pedestrians wore garments that blended eras, futuristic yet strangely dated. Then came the actors. Jimmy Stewart appeared, but this was no film I recognized. His hair was styled differently, his face bore lines that no movie in his career ever captured. He moved through scenes with Kim Novak, younger and softer than any performance I'd seen, her voice carrying unfamiliar inflections. They discussed plans for a shopping complex replacing the Miller's Warehouse District, an area demolished just last month with construction slated for spring. The weight in my throat was as dry as sandpaper. The audience below sat entranced, faces glowing in projection light, unblinking and serene, as if under a shared spell. When the 93-minute reel ended, they quietly filed out, dreamy and distant, as though awakening from a collective trance. I scrambled to rewind the reel, desperate for proof of what I'd witnessed. But the film dissolved, not melting, but becoming translucent, vanishing frame by frame, leaving only empty leader tape and a sharp scent of ozone lingering in the air. That night, sleep deserted me. In my apartment above the hardware store, I lay rigid beneath the ceiling's pale light, every frame replaying relentlessly. My muscles tensed, nerves electric, every creak and groan of the building amplified in my heightened state. 3 nights later, a second unmarked canister appeared. This time, the reel featured Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck in a romantic drama set amidst my own downtown. They spoke candidly about the upcoming mayoral election, naming candidates who had only just announced their bids. Campaign rallies played out in streets not yet chosen, speeches echoing verbatim events I would later witness firsthand. Predictions of vote tallies surfaced weeks before official tallies were released. The terror tightened its grip. My hands developed an unrelenting tremor, turning simple tasks into agonizing challenges. The tremor in my hands grew worse with each passing day, a relentless tremble that turned simple tasks, threading film, jotting notes, even holding a coffee cup, into agonizing challenges. Every screening of those impossible films dragged me deeper into a waking nightmare where time bent and reality frayed at the edges. I began keeping meticulous records, desperate to capture every detail, every anomaly. Each reel was more disturbing than the last, footage that defied logic and chronology, scenes that predated or predicted events with unsettling accuracy. The faces of actors shifted subtly, their expressions haunted by knowledge that I alone seemed to possess. Sleep became a scarce commodity. Nights were spent poring over the theater's archives and scouring local newspapers, trying to find any clues that could explain the origin of those unmarked reels. The projection booth, once a place of routine and comfort, became a chamber of shadows where I wrestled with creeping dread. One evening, while reviewing my notes, I discovered a pattern in the dates when the mysterious reels appeared. They coincided with anniversaries of tragedies in the town, fires, disappearances, and other calamities long buried in the past. The films seemed to surface as spectral echoes tied to those events, their haunting images a grim reminder that the past refused to remain buried. I confronted the theater manager, but he dismissed my concerns as stress-induced hallucinations, urging me to take time off. But I couldn't. The theater and the reels had claimed me. I was bound to their story, a reluctant witness to a truth too terrible to ignore. As the weeks dragged on, the boundary between the projection booth and the spectral world it bridged began to thin. Shadows lengthened, whispers filled the air, and fleeting glimpses of ghostly figures appeared in the flicker of the projector's light. One night, as the final reel played, I saw her, a woman in a faded dress, standing in the aisle among the empty seats. Her eyes were hollow pools of sorrow, and when our gazes met, a silent plea echoed through the air, "Remember us." I knew then that my role was no longer just about showing films. I was a guardian of memories, a keeper of stories lost to time, standing watch at the fragile threshold between worlds. But the question remained, how long could I hold the darkness at bay before it consumed me entirely? The weight of her gaze lingered long after the reel ended, the woman in the faded dress, her hollow eyes etched into my mind like a silent accusation. I sat alone in the projection booth, heart pounding, as the theater's heavy silence wrapped around me like a shroud. The flickering light of the projector cast dancing shadows, each one a reminder that I was no longer just a man tending to a film, I was a sentinel guarding the memories of the lost. Determined to find a way to end the haunting, I plunged deeper into the theater's tangled history. Late nights in the dusty archives yielded fragments of forgotten tragedies, fires that consumed whole blocks, unexplained disappearances, rumors of dark rituals performed in secret basements beneath the city streets. The theater itself was built atop land scarred by sorrow, a place where grief and loss had soaked into the very earth. One name surfaced repeatedly in my research, Elias Hawthorne, a reclusive filmmaker rumored to have dabbled in forbidden arts. Legend held that his last film, never publicly released, was cursed, capable of bending reality, trapping viewers in a liminal space between life and death. Some whispered that the mysterious reels I had seen were fragments of this lost work, resurfacing to ensnare new souls. Armed with this knowledge, I sought out an elderly librarian, the last living person who had known Hawthorne. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and resolve as she handed me a brittle, leather-bound manuscript. "You must understand," she whispered, "the theater is a doorway. The film, it is a trap. To break the cycle, you must confront the shadows and remember." That night, armed with the manuscript and a flickering lantern, I descended into the theater's forgotten basement, a labyrinth of cold stone corridors and long-abandoned projection equipment. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Somewhere deep below, the echoes of the past whispered and stirred. As I stepped into a cavernous chamber, the temperature dropped, and spectral figures began to coalesce, faces from the films, trapped souls reaching out with silent pleas. The woman in the faded dress appeared once more, her eyes pleading. With trembling hands, I recited the incantations penned by Hawthorne, words that twisted and curled in the air like smoke. The chamber pulsed with energy, shadows writhed, and the spectral figures wavered between presence and absence. A blinding light erupted from the lantern, cutting through the darkness and shattering the phantasms. The oppressive weight lifted. For the first time in years, the theater felt still. I knew the battle was far from over, but in that moment, I had reclaimed a sliver of hope. I had remembered. The dawn seeped through the cracks in the basement ceiling, softening the shadows that had gripped the Orpheum for so long. I emerged from the depths, the leather-bound manuscript clutched tightly in my hands, its pages now smudged and worn from frantic readings and whispered incantations. The air above ground felt different, lighter, as if the theater itself exhaled a long-held breath. In the days that followed, the oppressive weight that had settled over the Orpheum began to lift. The flickering light steadied, the haunting whispers faded, and the strange, unmarked reels ceased their unsettling appearances. Patrons returned with bright eyes and unburdened smiles, no longer trapped in a dreamlike haze. Yet, the scars remained, not just in the theater's creaking floors or faded walls, but etched deep within me. The memories of spectral faces, the chilling pleas for remembrance, and the heavy knowledge of the network I had unwittingly become part of refused to fade. I found solace in the journal and manuscript, now carefully locked away, reminders of a battle fought on the razor's edge between reality and the unknown. The theater reopened fully, its marquee glowing warmly, inviting a new generation to discover the magic of cinema without the shadows that once haunted its halls. But at night, when the world fell silent, I still heard faint echoes, ghostly reels spinning softly in the darkness, calling out across the thin veil that separates our world from the next. I understood then that some stories never truly end. They merely wait, patient, persistent, for someone to remember. And as the new guardian of the Orpheum's secrets, I would remain vigilant, standing watch at the threshold, ready to confront the shadows should they ever return. The relentless toll on my body and mind was impossible to ignore. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a churning nausea that twisted my insides and kept me perpetually on edge. Cold sweats would erupt without warning, soaking through my shirts and leaving me shivering in the booth's stale, recycled air. My vision blurred at the edges, as if reality itself was beginning to unravel before me. The pattern of the mysterious reels was unyielding. Every few nights, a new canister would materialize in the booth, always unmarked, always containing footage that twisted familiar faces into unfamiliar roles, actors playing parts they never played, speaking of events yet to happen but destined to unfold with terrifying precision in our city. Cary Grant discussed the renovation of the old bank building 3 days before the plans were even made public. Grace Kelly attended a charity auction for items that wouldn't be donated for another month. Clark Gable investigated a factory accident that would occur exactly as depicted 2 weeks after the screening. Each film dissolved upon rewinding, leaving no proof of its existence except for the unsettling sense that the audience, and I, were caught in a temporal loop. The déjà vu spread like a contagion through the community of late-night moviegoers. Patrons approached me after screenings, their faces confused, recalling scenes that seemed familiar yet inexplicable. Mrs. Patterson, a retired librarian and frequent Tuesday attendee, spoke nervously about the upcoming city council meeting. She insisted she had already witnessed the arguments, already knew which proposals would pass and which would fail. Her descriptions matched the mysterious film from the previous night exactly. When I suggested she might be mistaken, her eyes glazed over, distant and hollow, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The boundary between the futures projected on screen and the present reality began to blur in my own mind. I found myself anticipating conversations before they happened, knowing outcomes with an uncomfortable certainty. Dreams and memories merged, visions of actors performing scenes that dissolved like smoke upon waking. The smell of ozone clung to my clothes and hair, an invisible mark of the temporal distortions I was exposed to. By December, the physical toll had become severe. My reflection revealed a man aged beyond his years, sunken cheeks, restless eyes darting toward unseen shadows. My supervisor expressed concern, urging me to take sick leave. But abandoning the booth felt impossible. Panic gripped me at the thought. The force behind these phenomena seemed tied directly to me, to my role as the projectionist, the conduit through which these impossible films reached the world. The breakthrough came during a particularly intense screening featuring Marilyn Monroe in a role showcasing a dramatic depth far beyond her known works. The film depicted a crisis at the chemical plant outside town, with evacuation procedures and emergency responses laid out in unnerving detail. But this time, as the camera panned over the evacuation zone, a fleeting figure appeared, a figure operating a movie camera. It was me. Not a lookalike, but me, wearing the very clothes I wore that night, filming the very scene I was projecting. The recursive impossibility sent my mind reeling, but amid the chaos came a terrible clarity. I wasn't just witnessing prophetic films, I was trapped in their creation, caught in a loop of causality beyond comprehension. The films weren't mere visions of the future, they were recordings of events happening simultaneously, events past and yet to come, all twisted together in a temporal knot. I realized then that my role was far more than projectionist. I was the anchor, the pivot point of a phenomenon rewriting time itself in this fragile corner of reality. The weight of this realization settled over me like a suffocating fog. I was no longer a mere observer of these impossible films, I was a thread woven into their very fabric, a fulcrum on which past, present, and future balanced precariously. The projection booth had become both my prison and my stage, a liminal space where time looped and fractured, and reality was endlessly rewritten. Desperation fueled my next moves. I started to meticulously document every screening, every anomaly, every flicker and whisper in the booth. I sketched timelines, attempting to map the convergence of events and the looping narratives embedded in the films. Each entry revealed new complexities, subtle shifts in dialogue, fleeting cameos of familiar faces, and eerie echoes of conversations I was destined to have. Sleep grew elusive, nightmares replacing rest. I dreamed of endless corridors lined with flickering screens, each replaying scenes I could neither change nor escape. I saw myself filming, endlessly circling the same event, trapped in a kaleidoscope of moments folding into one another. In waking hours, reality frayed further. Conversations overlapped, days blurred, and the future slipped into the present. I often caught myself speaking of events before they happened, leaving friends and colleagues unsettled by my uncanny foresight. I sought answers beyond the theater. I delved into local lore, seeking out historians and physicists, desperate for explanations of temporal loops and causality paradoxes. Some dismissed my tales as madness, others whispered of ancient forces, liminal spaces where time bled like a wound. One cold evening, I discovered a faded photograph tucked inside an old projectionist manual, an image of the very booth I worked in, surrounded by figures in period clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. Scribbled on the back was a date, 1923. Beneath it, a single phrase, "Keeper of the Loop." I realized then that I was not the first, and wouldn't be the last, to be ensnared. The loop was eternal. And I was trapped within its endless reel. The final canister arrived on New Year's Eve, its presence more ominous than any before. I unlatched it with trembling hands, the cold metal sending a shiver through me. As the film began to spool, the flickering light revealed a scene that would haunt me forever. Inside the Orpheum's projection booth sat an older version of myself, weathered and worn, white hair framing a face etched with deep lines of time and sorrow. His movements were careful, ritualistic, threading an unmarked reel with the precision I had come to emulate over these endless nights. He glanced directly into the camera, his eyes held a terrible knowledge, a resignation I was yet to understand. The reel continued, showing the older me sitting back, watching the familiar mechanical rhythm of the projector. But then the camera shifted focus, illuminating his face as the light played across it, and there, in a chilling cycle, his features began to reverse, growing younger with each passing moment until he looked exactly like I did in that very instant. The recursive loop was complete, eternal and inescapable. Panic surged, and I fled the booth, heart hammering as though to break free of my ribs. But my legs failed me in the lobby, weighted by an invisible force. Gentle yet unyielding, it pulled me back upstairs, back into the booth where the reel continued to spin, showing an endless cycle of my future selves trapped in the same relentless pattern. Each iteration, believing for the first time they had encountered the phenomenon. Now I comprehend my role in this labyrinth of time. I am both witness and creator, victim and perpetrator, bound within an endless loop of projecting films that reveal the future while simultaneously manifesting it. Hollywood's golden era actors have become unwitting chroniclers of events outside normal time, their performances captured by impossible cameras operated by versions of myself spanning decades. The collective déjà vu among late-night audiences is no accident, it is the purpose. Each screening implants memories of future events, weaving a shared subconscious that steers the town toward its fated path. The film's dissolution upon rewinding is not destruction but transformation, the physical medium converting into pure information that imprints itself on the observer's mind. I continue my role nightly, threading the mysterious canisters with mechanical precision. My trembling hands are steady now, terror has shifted into numb acceptance. My body exists in a state of heightened awareness, as if straddling multiple points in time. The town unfolds precisely as the films predict, the shopping center opening as scheduled, the mayoral election following the cinematic prophecy, the chemical plant crisis resolved exactly as depicted by Marilyn Monroe's spectral performance. Those affected by the collective déjà vu live slightly ahead of normal time, their trust in the inexplicable certainties shaping a community synchronized with a predetermined future. Between threading reels, I glimpse the cameras filming me, operated by other versions of myself caught in this recursive nightmare. We exchange silent nods, acknowledging our shared imprisonment in a temporal machine none fully comprehend but all serve. The Orpheum Theater has transcended its role as a mere movie house. It is a nexus where past, present, and future collapse into an infinite cycle of projection and perception, of creation and captivity, where I am forever both the projectionist and the projected. Story 4. The water never felt right at Millbrook Lake. Even beneath the broad daylight sun, which should have gilded the surface into a shimmering mirror, something below devoured the light, leaving only unnatural darkness that made my skin crawl every time I submerged. My name is Marcus Chen. For over 20 years, I have taught people to breathe underwater. I've plunged into cenotes in Mexico, places where ancient Mayans once cast offerings to their gods, explored shipwrecks haunted by men who died gasping for air they'd never reclaim, and navigated underwater caves pulsing with a heartbeat that felt malevolent. Yet nothing had prepared me for the eerie depths of Millbrook Lake in upstate New York. The lake was a marvel of modern engineering, or so I was told when I arrived 3 months ago. A massive dam project, completed in 2005, had flooded what was once a shallow valley dotted with farms and an old mining road. 20 years of carefully controlled water levels had created an environment perfect for my diving instruction business, clean, predictable, and safe, as the brochures claimed. But the first time I descended to the lake's deeper reaches, 60 feet down, my pulse quickened beneath my wetsuit. Stone structures. Not the concrete blocks of a modern dam, but weathered, ancient stone walls. Their angles defied logic, corners bent impossibly, archways curved inward on themselves, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water behind the mask. I told myself it was just an old mining settlement. Perhaps the records were incomplete, maybe there had been more development in the valley than anyone remembered. Yet, as I floated 40 feet above what appeared to be an entire street grid laid out in agonizingly precise geometric patterns, my breathing grew shallow and rapid. The hiss of my regulator was too loud, echoing oddly through the water. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I swam toward the surface, the cold gripping me like ice, though the temperature should have been a tolerable 50 degrees. That night, I pored over every scrap of information, property records, geological surveys, old newspaper clippings. The official documents were maddeningly sparse, a few scattered notes on failed mining ventures and abandoned farms, but nothing that explained the elaborate stonework beneath the lake. More unsettling was the pristine emptiness of those records, as though someone had scrubbed away all evidence of what truly lay beneath. Determined, I returned the next morning with an underwater camera, intent on documenting my discovery. The descent was different. Thick, resistant water clung to me, as if it wished to hold me back. The pressure in my ears surged, far beyond what the gauges indicated. When I reached the stone structures, my camera refused to focus, every frame blurred and warped as if something interfered with the lens. But my eyes told the truth. Walls stretched endlessly, forming a perfect town square surrounded by buildings whose architecture defied time and place. The stonework was impossibly smooth, precise, carved by tools lost to history, or perhaps tools that never should have existed. The deeper I ventured beneath Millbrook's surface, the more the water seemed to thicken around me, a viscous veil that dulled my senses and tangled my thoughts. The walls stretched endlessly, enclosing me in a labyrinth older than memory itself. The eerie silence was punctuated only by the distant crackle of my regulator, each breath a fragile tether to the world above. As I swam through the impossible streets, my flashlight illuminated symbols etched into the stone, glyphs that pulsed faintly with a cold, blue light. They were unlike any language I'd seen, their shapes shifting subtly when caught at different angles, as if alive and watching. At the center of this submerged city lay a structure that defied description, a towering ziggurat rising from the lakebed, its summit lost in the murky depths above. The stones bore carvings of creatures half-formed, beings caught between water and shadow, their eyes glinting with an intelligence that unsettled my very soul. My mind raced to understand. Was this a forgotten civilization swallowed by the dam's creation? Or something far older, an alien architecture built by hands not bound by time? A sudden movement caught my eye, ripples where no current should be. Shadows flickered just beyond the light's reach. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as an overwhelming sense of being watched took hold. The water seemed to pulse with a presence, ancient and indifferent. I realized then the lake was no longer simply water and stone. It was a gateway, a liminal place where worlds converged and boundaries blurred. Retracing my path, my ascent felt suffocating, the water resisting as if reluctant to release me. When I finally broke the surface, gasping, the sunlight seemed hollow, the world above both familiar and strangely distant. In the weeks that followed, my dreams became haunted by visions of those underwater streets, of whispered voices in a language just beyond comprehension, and eyes that watched from the depths. I knew my discovery was only the beginning. Millbrook Lake was a door waiting to be opened. My breathing grew rapid and shallow as I focused on details that churned my stomach. Windows, dozens of them, dark and empty, yet perfectly intact. Not the shattered remnants one might expect after 20 years underwater, but pristine frames, as if freshly carved. The glass was crystal clear, unfazed by years beneath the lake's surface. So engrossed was I in these impossible windows that I nearly missed the flicker in my peripheral vision, something pale and elongated slipping past an archway. My heart thundered as I spun around, but only empty stone corridors stretched into shadow. I checked my air gauge, still ample, but my hands trembled violently, making the numbers nearly unreadable. The swim back to the surface dragged endlessly, every few strokes accompanied by a glance over my shoulder. Though the water behind me appeared empty, a gnawing dread whispered that something lurked in the darkness, tracking me silently. The following week, I tried to focus on my routine, teaching diving lessons, guiding tourists and certification students, but the wrongness clung like a heavy shroud. Students noticed my distraction, commenting on my nervousness and how I compulsively checked my gear. One woman mentioned how labored my breathing sounded, even at shallow depths. Nightmares plagued my sleep. In dreams, I plunged beneath the lake to find every window glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Shadowy forms moved behind the glass, always just out of focus, watching me with an intensity that filled my dream self with silent screams. Each morning, I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing as though I'd fled some unseen terror. My apartment felt stifling, walls closing in. I locked doors obsessively at night, though I couldn't explain what I feared. 2 weeks after my first dive among the structures, I made a decision both inevitable and terrifying: I would dive at night. I'd done night dives before, oceans and quarries across the world, drawn by the challenge and mystery darkness brought. But this was different. At 11 p.m. by the lake's edge, my hands shook so badly I dropped my mask twice before securing it. My flashlight's beam seemed feeble as I descended. Darkness closed in from every side, a void so absolute I felt swallowed by the abyss between stars. My breathing was ragged, heart pounding as I forced myself to slow, mindful of precious air. At 50 feet, my light caught the first glimpse of stone. But the windows, those impossible windows, glowed. Not with electrical light, but a sickly green radiance emanating from deep within the submerged buildings. The glow was alien, wavelengths my eyes were never meant to perceive. Tears pricked my eyes, and my head spun. My mouth dried inside the regulator, the rush of blood thudded in my ears, mingling with the mechanical hiss of my breathing apparatus. Every primal instinct screamed at me, ascend, flee, survive. But I was frozen, suspended in terror. Then shapes began to emerge within the glowing windows. Humanoid, but grotesquely wrong. Too tall, too thin. Their movements fluid, liquid, unnatural, as if unbound by bone or joint. They moved through the submerged interiors, occasionally pausing to peer out. And when they looked right at me. The weight of their gaze was unbearable, pressing through the murky water like a physical force. Those elongated figures lingered at the windows, their translucent forms flickering like shadows caught between worlds. I felt exposed, naked beneath their silent scrutiny, as if my very presence disturbed something ancient and unfathomable. My heart pounded wildly, each beat a thunderclap in my ears. My hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers tightening around my flashlight as if it were my only tether to reality. The urge to flee surged, primal and urgent, but the water around me thickened, resisting every movement as if trying to trap me in this underwater prison. I forced myself to kick, slow and deliberate, fighting the oppressive pull. The strange creatures continued to watch, their unblinking eyes reflecting a cold intelligence that chilled me to the core. Suddenly, a low hum began to vibrate through the water, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The green glow intensified, bathing the entire submerged city in an eerie light that made the water shimmer with unnatural hues. The hum grew louder, resonating deep within my chest, syncing with the pulsing rhythm of the glowing windows. I realized then that the structures were alive, or at least something within them was, an ancient, sleeping presence awakened by my intrusion. Panic welled up, and with a final burst of energy, I propelled myself upward, the water clawing at my limbs as I raced toward the surface. Breaking through the chilled night air, I gasped, lungs burning. I scrambled onto the shore, drenched and shaking, the glowing green light still seared into my mind. That night, sleep was impossible. The lake's darkness haunted my every thought, the faces in the windows etched into my nightmares. I knew I couldn't ignore what lay beneath Millbrook Lake. The secrets there were older than memory, and whatever dwelled in those sunken streets was watching, waiting. Marcus Chen's eyes burned from sleepless nights spent poring over every scrap of information he could find about Millbrook Lake and its submerged city. He knew that beneath those unnatural waters lay secrets that defied logic and history. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus reached out to local historians and experts in archaeology and geology, hoping for answers. Most dismissed his claims as fanciful, but a few agreed to accompany him on dives, drawn by his passion and the mystery itself. As they descended into the murky depths, their lights revealed more of the city's impossible architecture, sharp angles, smooth stonework, and windows glowing faintly with that eerie green light. The team documented the structures with cameras and sonar, but the deeper they went, the more the equipment malfunctioned. Compass needles spun wildly, instruments faltered, and an unsettling feeling gripped them all. One night, during a dive near the towering submerged ziggurat, the team encountered figures, those pale, elongated entities moving fluidly through the water. They observed without aggression, their eyes reflecting ancient intelligence. Yet, their presence filled the divers with an overwhelming sense of being watched, judged. Back on shore, Marcus studied ancient texts and folklore, finding stories of water spirits, guardians of forgotten realms, and entities trapped between worlds. He theorized that these beings were remnants of a civilization erased from history, or perhaps custodians of a reality layered beneath his own. The lake, he realized, was a threshold, a portal connecting his world with something far older and stranger. And by exploring it, he had awakened forces better left undisturbed. Haunted by his discoveries, Marcus knew the boundary was fragile. The city beneath Millbrook Lake held secrets that could unravel reality itself, and now, he was entangled in its dark embrace. The cold night air pressed heavily against my skin as I sat by the shore, the water's surface shimmering faintly under the moonlight. The luminescent green glow beneath the lake pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of some ancient, slumbering beast. The weight of what I'd uncovered pressed down on me. This was no ordinary sunken town. It was a living memory, a nexus where past and present collided, guarded by those pale, fluid beings that watched with eyes far older than time itself. Determined to break through the silence, I prepared for a different kind of dive, a dive not just of exploration, but of communication. Equipped with underwater recording devices, sensors, and ancient symbols I'd painstakingly traced from the stone walls, I dove once more into the abyss. As I approached the towering ziggurat, the water thickened, resistance mounting like a physical barrier. The familiar green glow pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie light upon the glyphs etched into the stones. I laid the carved symbols before me, hoping their shapes might resonate with whatever force lingered. Suddenly, the water around me stirred. The pale figures emerged, circling silently, their movements graceful yet disconcertingly fluid. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, faint impressions formed, a sequence of images and emotions that flooded my mind, ancient rituals, a civilization's rise and fall, a desperate pact made to preserve knowledge and power beneath the waters. I understood then, these entities were guardians, bound by duty and ancient oath, preserving a secret too dangerous for the surface world. They were not malevolent but wary, protectors of a fragile boundary. I tried to convey peace, extending a hand in the darkness. The beings responded not with words, but with a subtle shift in the water's currents, a gentle acknowledgement. Emerging from the depths, I carried with me the burden of understanding and a solemn promise, to respect the boundary and safeguard the secrets hidden beneath Millbrook Lake. Yet, I knew this was but the beginning. The lake held more mysteries, and my journey into the unknown had only just begun. The figure's slow, deliberate beckoning sent a wave of dread crashing through me, hypnotic, nightmarish in its eerie rhythm. One after another, they appeared at the windows, their translucent forms perfectly synchronized in that chilling invitation. My regulator suddenly felt wrong, each breath a struggle against an invisible resistance, the air thickening as if the very water conspired to suffocate me. My wetsuit, once a shield of warmth and buoyancy, constricted like a living shroud tightening around my chest and limbs. Panic clawed at my throat as the figures moved away from their windows, gliding through doorways and archways, like liquid moonlight taking shape, toward me. They were coming out. Coming for me. I tried to swim upward, but my limbs betrayed me. The water thickened, dragging me down as if the lake itself wanted to claim me. My fins churned frantically, but I barely held my depth, the pressure mounting like an unrelenting weight. Then, emerging fully from the submerged buildings, they flowed in spectral waves, human-shaped but grotesquely distorted, stretched like taffy beyond recognition. Their faces, hauntingly human yet void of any warmth or emotion, bore expressions of cold intelligence and grim purpose. They formed a loose circle around me, moving without creating bubbles or disturbing the water's surface, as if their very essence skirted the physical realm. Their large, luminous eyes tracked my every twitch with predatory precision. Their beckoning grew urgent, insistent, guiding me deeper into the submerged city toward impossibly tall, cathedral-like spires rising from the lakebed's shadowed depths. My air gauge showed plenty left, but my breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. Panic consumed me, each exhale was a desperate plea for life. My heart thundered painfully against my ribs, threatening to burst. As they closed in, details that shattered my sanity revealed themselves, translucent skin revealing swirling currents of light, stars captured in liquid form beneath their surface. One reached toward my mask with impossibly long fingers jointed in unnatural ways. When those fingers touched my equipment, a shock pulsed through me, not electrical, but something primal, vibrating my very atoms at forbidden frequencies. The paralysis broke. Adrenaline surged as I kicked upward with raw desperation, abandoning all protocol. The figures did not pursue aggressively but maintained their silent, relentless vigil, following my ascent with unyielding patience. Their eyes never left me, their beckoning hands extending still, as if confident that I would return, drawn inevitably back into the depths of their underwater domain, joining whatever eternal purpose bound them beneath Millbrook Lake. The surface rushed toward me like salvation, but the lake's grip was relentless. My lungs burned, every breath a ragged gasp as I fought the unseen pull dragging me back. The night air finally broke across my face, sharp and cold, a cruel reminder of the fragile divide between two worlds. I scrambled onto the shore, collapsing onto the damp earth, heart hammering, sweat mingling with lake water. Behind me, the eerie green glow beneath the surface flickered and faded, but I knew the watchers had not gone. Their eyes lingered just beyond the veil, patient and eternal. In the days that followed, I was a man changed. The terror I had tried to suppress now gnawed at every thought. Sleep was fractured, haunted by visions of swirling lights and endless stone corridors beneath the lake. I began obsessively researching ancient myths, local legends, forgotten rites tied to water and otherworldly guardians. The stories spoke of sentinels bound to protect hidden realms, souls tethered between dimensions, and pacts made long ago to guard secrets humanity was never meant to uncover. Friends noticed my withdrawal, my hollowed eyes and trembling hands. I tried to explain but found the words failed me. How could I share what defied reason? One night, compelled by a force I could not resist, I returned to the lake's edge. The water was still, the surface reflecting the moon's cold gaze. I whispered a vow into the night, to understand, to respect, and if possible, to find peace with the ancient beings beneath. The lake answered with a soft ripple, a pulse that echoed deep within my soul. I knew then my journey was far from over. Millbrook Lake held its secrets close, and I was now part of its endless story, a story written in stone, shadow, and shimmering green light beneath the depths. Marcus sat by the edge of Millbrook Lake, the cold night air biting through his soaked clothes. The eerie green glow still pulsed faintly beneath the water's surface, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that bound him to this place. Sleep had become a fleeting memory, and each night the weight of the lake's hold tightened around his soul. Desperate, Marcus reached out beyond the small circle of his acquaintances. He scoured forums dedicated to the paranormal and obscure folklore, searching for anyone who had encountered similar phenomena. After countless dead ends and dismissals, he finally found a lead, a reclusive woman named Dr. Ilara Voss, an expert in liminal spaces and ancient water spirits, living several states away. Their first conversation was terse and cautious. Ilara spoke in measured tones, her knowledge steeped in ancient rituals and forgotten pacts. She warned Marcus that the lake was no ordinary body of water, it was a threshold, a portal guarded by beings older than humanity itself. Breaking free would require more than willpower, it would demand a confrontation with forces that transcended the physical world. Undeterred, Marcus traveled to meet her, bringing with him the journal of symbols he had painstakingly documented and a recording of the glowing windows beneath the lake. Ilara examined the materials with a mixture of fascination and grave concern. "The beings you describe," she said softly, "are custodians of a balance we barely understand. To sever their hold, you must perform a cleansing rite, an ancient ceremony meant to appease the guardians and release the tether that binds you." Together, they prepared for the ritual, gathering rare herbs, sacred waters, and carved talismans etched with protective glyphs. The ceremony was to be performed at midnight by the lake's shore, where the boundary between worlds was thinnest. As night fell, the air grew heavy with anticipation. Marcus and Ilara arranged the talismans in a circle, lighting candles whose flames flickered against the dark water. Ilara chanted in a language that twisted and curled through the air, invoking peace and balance. The lake responded. The green glow intensified, ripples forming intricate patterns across the surface. Pale figures emerged, drifting silently toward the shore. Their luminous eyes regarded Marcus not with menace, but with an ancient sorrow. Ilara's voice rose, steady and unwavering, weaving the ritual's final words. A hush fell, broken only by the gentle lapping of water. Then, as if released from a centuries-old binding, the glow dimmed. The figures receded, dissolving into the depths. Breath caught in his throat, Marcus felt the weight begin to lift, a lightness he hadn't known in months. The lake was still. But he knew the guardians were always watching, patient and eternal. The ritual by Millbrook Lake had lifted the immediate weight from Marcus's shoulders, but the aftermath unfolded like shadows lengthening at dusk, quiet, insidious, and impossible to ignore. Though the eerie green glow beneath the water had dimmed to near invisibility, Marcus sensed the lake's pulse had not ceased. It now throbbed with a different rhythm, subtle and distant, like a heartbeat barely out of reach. Nights remained restless, dreams no longer screamed with terror but whispered with cryptic voices, their messages half-formed and slipping away before he could grasp them. His senses sharpened unervingly. Sounds too faint for others reached his ears, a faint bubbling beneath his bedroom floorboards, a soft rustle in the wind that carried voices just beyond comprehension. Shadows seemed to twist at the edge of vision, and reflections in mirrors flickered with figures not his own. Physically, Marcus felt altered. His skin prickled with sensations of water's cool embrace even when dry, his dreams carried weight, as if the lake's depths had become part of his consciousness. Occasionally, he caught fleeting glimpses of the pale, elongated figures lurking just beyond the veil of the real world, watching, waiting. More troubling were the unexplained phenomena at the lake itself. Fishermen reported nets snagged by unseen forces, boats malfunctioned without cause, water levels rose and fell in patterns defying natural cycles. Local wildlife behaved erratically, and old tales of the lake's cursed nature resurfaced among the townsfolk, whispered in hushed tones. One evening, Marcus received a package, an unmarked, water-stained envelope containing a single photograph. It depicted the submerged city's towering ziggurat, bathed not in eerie green light but glowing faintly with a pale, ethereal blue. Scribbled on the back was a phrase in an ancient script he didn't recognize, yet somehow understood, "The door remains open." He realized then that the ritual had not closed the lake's mysteries, it had only peeled back one layer. The Guardian's watch was unbroken, the nexus still pulsed beneath the surface, an eternal enigma. Marcus understood his journey was far from over. The lake had woven itself into the fabric of his existence, a silent sentinel calling him deeper into its secrets. The days that followed blurred into one another, each sunrise casting long shadows over Marcus's restless mind. The photograph, its pale blue glow shimmering even in the dim light of his cramped apartment, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, an unspoken summons he could neither ignore nor fully understand. Word began to spread quietly through the town. Strange occurrences at Millbrook Lake became impossible to dismiss, fishermen's nets tangled inexplicably, small boats lost power mid-lake, and wildlife behaved with a disturbing erraticism. Whispers surfaced in local diners and community centers, old legends resurrected, warnings passed down through generations about the lake's restless spirit. One evening, as Marcus stood at the water's edge, the air thick with mist, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman draped in weathered clothing, her eyes reflecting the lake's ethereal light. She introduced herself as Lila, a folklorist who had dedicated her life to studying the region's forgotten histories and hidden lore. Lila spoke of ancient rites, guardian spirits, and portals between worlds, her voice weaving stories that resonated deeply with Marcus's experiences. She believed that the submerged city beneath Millbrook was not merely a relic of the past, but a living nexus, a gateway that connected their world to others beyond comprehension. Together, Marcus and Lila began to unravel fragments of a long-forgotten prophecy, one that spoke of a chosen guardian, bound by fate to protect the delicate balance between realms. The photograph's cryptic message was but a warning, the door remained open, and forces beyond their understanding were stirring. Their research led them to unexpected allies, scientists, mystics, and locals who had glimpsed the lake's otherworldly side. As the circle of knowledge expanded, so did the dangers. Strange symbols appeared overnight etched into trees near the shore, and an unsettling silence fell over the town during the darkest hours. Marcus felt the lake's pull stronger than ever, a constant reminder that his role was far from over. The guardians beneath the surface watched, waiting for what would come next. The air around Millbrook Lake grew heavy, laden with a tension that prickled the skin and settled deep in the bones of the town. Shadows lengthened earlier each evening, and a silence hung thick, an expectant hush that seemed to hold its breath for something unseen. Marcus and Lila worked tirelessly, their nights filled with whispered conversations, old tomes, and hastily scribbled notes. The fragile circle of allies they'd gathered met in secret, sharing stories of inexplicable phenomena, sudden drops in temperature, unexplained lights flickering over the water, and a creeping unease that gnawed at the edges of their minds. The symbols carved into the trees near the shore became more frequent and intricate, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. Lila recognized them as sigils meant to ward and to bind, ancient seals intended to protect but now cracked and failing. One evening, as fog curled thickly over the lake, the group gathered at the water's edge for a vigil. Candles flickered, their flames dancing in the restless breeze, casting long, wavering shadows on the restless surface. As midnight approached, a low hum resonated from beneath the water, growing steadily into a haunting chorus. The surface rippled unnaturally, and pale figures began to rise, slowly, gracefully, from the depths, their elongated forms shimmering with that sickly green light Marcus had come to dread. The guardians were awakening. The group stood firm, chanting the protective incantations Lila had uncovered. The words wove through the night air, battling against the rising tide of otherworldly power. But the lake was a living thing, ancient and relentless, and the barrier between worlds thinned dangerously. Suddenly, the water surged, and a figure emerged, larger and more imposing than the rest, radiating a cold authority that stilled the wind and silenced the vigil. Its eyes locked with Marcus's, and in that moment, the burden of his guardianship pressed upon him heavier than ever. The fate of the town, the balance between realms, rested on a knife's edge. The towering figure's eyes bore into me, ancient, fathomless depths that seemed to peer straight into the core of my being. Its presence commanded the lake's very essence, a cold authority that silenced the night and sent shivers racing down the spines of everyone gathered. I could feel the weight of generations pressing on my shoulders, the legacy of guardian and prisoner intertwined. The waters churned around us, a swirling maelstrom of light and shadow as the boundary between worlds frayed dangerously thin. The entity's voice echoed, not through words, but as a resonance vibrating deep within my chest, filling my mind with visions, a cycle unbroken, a balance threatened, and a choice looming, one that could either bind or free us all. Lila's voice rose beside me, steady and clear as she recited the ancient rites she had painstakingly translated. Our circle joined, their chants weaving a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. The air pulsed with energy, the lake's glow intensifying to a blinding brilliance. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a shudder that rippled through the earth and water alike, the entity bowed its massive head, acknowledging our resolve. But the warning was clear, the balance was tenuous, the forces at play vast and patient. As the figure slowly retreated beneath the surface, the lake's glow faded to a gentle shimmer, the tension easing but never fully dissipating. I knew this was not an end, but a fragile truce. The guardians watched still, and my vigil continued. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and burning sage as Marcus, Lila, and their circle gathered beneath the skeletal branches of ancient trees near Millbrook Lake. The night was cool but charged, the stars muted behind a veil of low-hanging mist that seemed to seep up from the water itself. Every shadow carried a weight, every rustle whispered of unseen eyes watching just beyond the veil. The vigil had forged something unspoken between them, a bond tempered in fear and determination. They were no longer mere observers but guardians in their own right, entrusted with protecting the fragile boundary between their world and the restless realm beneath the lake. Lila unrolled ancient maps and scrolls, her fingers tracing faded symbols that mirrored the glowing sigils etched into the trees around them. The guardians below respond to patterns of energy, she explained, her voice low and steady. Our rituals must align with the lake's natural rhythms, or risk awakening forces beyond even their control. Marcus nodded, eyes scanning the horizon where the dark water lapped silently against the shore. We need to deepen our understanding, document every anomaly, every change. The lake's pulse is changing. It's a warning, not a threat, yet. They prepared tools both modern and arcane, sonar devices paired with talismans, recording equipment alongside sacred herbs and stones. Each member of the group carried a role, blending science with ancient wisdom in a delicate dance of defense. Training sessions were held in the days that followed, teaching the group to recognize signs of impending shifts, sudden drops in temperature, unexplained currents, the faint hum of the lake's energy. They practiced rituals drawn from Lila's research, chanting in voices low and resonant, casting protective circles, and learning to attune themselves to the subtle vibrations beneath the surface. Marcus spent hours diving near the submerged city, documenting every strange structure, every glimmer of the unnatural light. His encounters with the pale, elongated figures became less terrifying, more like glimpses of ancient custodians, watchers who demanded respect and balance. Yet, despite their preparations, unease lingered. The boundary was thin, frayed, and the lake's restless depths whispered of challenges yet to come. One evening, as twilight bled into night, a distant, mournful call echoed across the water, a sound unlike any natural animal or human voice. It stirred something deep within Marcus, a reminder that their vigilance must never waver. The lake had secrets yet to reveal, and the guardians of Millbrook were ready to face whatever darkness stirred beneath its restless surface. As the guardians deepened their vigilance over Millbrook Lake, the town itself began to shift in subtle yet undeniable ways. At first, the changes were so slight that many dismissed them as mere coincidence, whispers on the wind, fleeting glances, a creeping unease that settled like fog over familiar streets. Local fishermen spoke of strange currents that tangled their nets in impossible knots, pulling vessels toward unseen depths before releasing them unharmed but forever changed. Late-night boaters reported lights flickering beneath the surface, pulsing glows that danced just beyond the reach of their flashlights, as if the lake's ancient heart was stirring. In the town's quiet neighborhoods, residents felt the subtle tug of something out of sync. Clocks lost time, slipping forward or backward by minutes that left a lingering disorientation. Phones rang with no one on the line, and televisions flickered with static images that vanished the moment they were noticed. A growing number of townsfolk began sharing strange dreams, visions of endless underwater cities bathed in eerie light, shadowy figures reaching through glass windows, and cryptic symbols that burned into waking minds. These dreams weren't isolated, patterns emerged in conversations at diners and grocery stores, a collective subconscious knitting together threads of fear and fascination. Even the children, often oblivious to the world's shadows, whispered of unseen friends by the lake and strange voices carried on the breeze. The town's mayor called for calm, attributing the disturbances to natural phenomena and urging citizens to remain grounded. Yet the unease persisted, an undercurrent beneath everyday life that nothing official could erase. Marcus and Lila watched these ripples with growing concern. The Guardian's struggle beneath the lake was no longer confined to the water's depths, it was spreading outward, touching the very fabric of the town. They knew that as the boundary between worlds weakened, the challenges ahead would not just be fought underwater but would seep into the streets and homes of Millbrook itself. The Guardians prepared to stand as bulwarks, not only against the ancient forces beneath the waves but against the growing tide of uncertainty that threatened to engulf their community. The violent gasp of air burned my lungs as I broke the surface, launching myself entirely out of the water before crashing back down with a painful splash. My breathing was ragged, uncontrolled, heavy despite the unlimited air that had once filled my tanks. I tore off my mask and regulator, choking and gasping, desperate to reach the shore. But the night felt wrong, unnatural. The stars hung dim and distant, stripped of their usual sparkle, and the familiar chorus of insects and nightbirds was eerily absent. A crushing silence pressed in, broken only by the harsh rasp of my breathing and the soft, relentless lap of water against the rocks. Dragging myself onto the rocky beach, I couldn't help but glance back. The lake's surface was unnervingly calm, like a sheet of liquid obsidian, swallowing every glimmer and reflecting nothing. No stars, no moonlight, not even the beam from my flashlight dared to break its perfection. Beneath that black mirror, the faint glow remained, those sickly, pulsing lights in the windows. And if I strained my eyes, I thought I glimpsed shapes moving just below the surface, tracing the shoreline as if patrolling the fragile boundary between their submerged realm and mine. My hands trembled so violently as I gathered my scattered gear that buckles and straps seemed impossible to fasten. Every few seconds, my eyes darted back to the water, expecting those elongated forms to breach the surface, dripping with otherworldly fluid as they crossed from their liquid domain into the world of air and flesh. The drive home was a haze of paranoia, constant glances into the rearview mirror, white-knuckled grips on the steering wheel. Every shadow flickered with menace, every reflection in a store window seemed to shift independently, as if alive. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I haven't returned to the lake. I've cancelled every diving appointment for the month. My students whisper of sickness. Maybe I am, sick with the knowledge of what lurks beneath waters meant to cradle nothing but fish, algae, and the occasional sunken relic. But the dreams have worsened. Each night, I find myself submerged again in that impossible city, this time without gear, breathing the water as naturally as air, gliding with the same fluid grace as the beings who dwell there. They greet me not as intruder, but as kin, guiding me through streets and buildings that stretch impossibly deep. In these dreams, the truth reveals itself. The city did not rise after the lake was made. The lake was created because of the city. Someone long ago, knew what lay beneath and sought to bury it beneath water, hoping to contain whatever ancient power lived there. But barriers are double-edged. They imprison, yes, but they also delineate boundaries that can be crossed under the right conditions. Each night, I cross that boundary with less resistance, linger longer, feel more at home among those glowing stone streets than in my waking life. I awaken with the taste of lake water lingering on my tongue, and that beckoning call echoes in my ears, relentless. My apartment feels increasingly alien, uncomfortable, a cage, while the memory of the submerged city pulls me back, more vivid and real than any waking pleasure. Yesterday, without conscious thought, I found myself driving to the lake. I sat in my car at the access road's edge for over an hour, staring into the obsidian depths, feeling the irresistible urge to suit up, to dive once more into the waiting. Because they are waiting. Their patience spans centuries, their certainty unshaken. They have waited long before the dam's waters claimed the valley, long before any man dreamed of this lake. They have waited for someone like me. A bridge. A key. And I know I am not the first. Others have come. Swimmers who vanished without trace. Divers swallowed by the depths. Lost souls who now wander those impossible, glowing streets, forever part of the city beneath Millbrook Lake. The night air was thick with an electric stillness as Marcus sat in his car, eyes locked on the dark surface of Millbrook Lake. The pull was relentless, a force deeper than fear or reason, an ancient summons whispering through the marrow of his bones. The weight of the past week's terror wrestled with a strange longing, a craving for understanding that gnawed at his very soul. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his gear, the familiar weight of the wetsuit and oxygen tanks both comforting and suffocating. Each strap fastened was a promise, to face the unknown, to pierce the veil that had long kept secrets beneath the water's obsidian face. The shore was deserted, the usual night sounds swallowed by an oppressive silence. Marcus slipped into the lake, the cold biting but familiar. As he descended, the world above faded to a muted echo, replaced by the suffocating embrace of the depths. The glowing windows greeted him like silent sentinels, their sickly green light painting ghostly patterns on the smooth stone. Shapes flickered in the periphery, elongated, fluid forms watching from shadowed archways. His heart pounded, but his breath found steadiness. Tonight, he would confront whatever lay beneath. Deeper into the submerged city he swam, the water thickening around him, the pressure mounting not just in his lungs but in the very fabric of his being. The ziggurat loomed ahead, its jagged spires rising like a cathedral to some forgotten god. From the shadows, the pale figures emerged, circling once more with slow, hypnotic grace. Yet this time, Marcus met their gaze without flinching. He raised a hand, steady and deliberate, a silent plea for parley. The figures paused, the water stilling like a breath held in suspension. The air around him seemed to shimmer, the boundary between worlds growing thin. Then, a voice, not spoken but felt, reached into his mind, ancient and vast. "You seek the truth, bearer of the light. But truth is a tide that can drown or deliver. Will you embrace what lies beneath?" Marcus swallowed, the weight of his journey pressing down, but his resolve was unwavering. "I will," he replied, voice firm despite the crushing silence. The water around him shifted, the glowing windows flaring in response. The city breathed, alive, waiting, ready to reveal its secrets to the one who dared descend. As Marcus lingered beneath the shimmering glow of the submerged city, the water around him thickened and pulsed like the breath of some ancient, slumbering giant. The luminous windows flickered, casting ghostly light on the stone walls that twisted impossibly in every direction. The airless silence was profound, a weight pressing in on his mind as much as his body. The voice echoed in his mind again, not words but impressions, feelings that swept over him like waves. The city was built to guard, to preserve, to bind. To hold the knowledge of worlds that should never merge. The enormity of that truth settled deep within him. This was no mere relic, but a sentinel on the threshold of realities. As he moved deeper, the buildings seemed to stretch and fold around him, geometry bending and folding in impossible ways. The stone beneath his fingertips vibrated faintly, alive with stories etched in glyphs older than any language he knew. His flashlight revealed visions beneath the surface, echoes of a civilization that had thrived, then vanished, consumed by the very powers they sought to contain. Suddenly, the pale figures reformed, their fluid movements slowing as they circled him with growing intensity. Their luminous eyes reflected ancient sorrow and wary judgment. Marcus felt their presence probing, as if testing his worthiness. A trial awaited, not of strength or skill, but of spirit and purpose. Visions surged through his mind, choices made, sacrifices endured, a fragile balance between destruction and preservation. The city's fate, and perhaps that of his world, hung in the balance. Steeling himself, Marcus knew the path forward demanded acceptance of truths both terrible and beautiful, embracing the darkness to safeguard the light. As the currents swirled and the city breathed around him, the final challenge began. The transformation had begun long before I fully understood it. Those drawn to the depths, those who never surfaced again, they now dwell in that luminous community, where human physics and biology dissolve into something else entirely. I can feel myself shifting, becoming something capable of existing in both worlds. My reflection in mirrors warp subtly, an uncanny distortion I avoid facing head-on. Water tastes different now, not the sterile, chlorinated liquid from taps, but something alive, warm, and inviting. Tonight, I am returning to the lake, not with tanks or suits, but to swim freely, to cross the thinning boundary and join them fully. The city beneath Millbrook Lake calls to me, its ancient pulse entwined with my own, and I am ready at last to answer. Story 5. The first time I noticed something strange, I blamed the whiskey. But whiskey doesn't age brass doorknobs 70 years overnight. My name is Marcus Webb. For 23 years, I've been the one people call when they're locked out, emergency locksmith services, as my business cards say. What they don't say is how many of those calls come from houses that should have been demolished decades ago, in neighborhoods where the streetlights flicker like dying fireflies, and silence clings thick enough to suffocate. It began 6 months ago with a call at 12:47 a.m. The voice was elderly, trembling. The caller explained she'd somehow locked herself inside her grandmother's bedroom in an old Victorian on Elm Street. I asked why she couldn't use another door. She said there wasn't one. The room had been sealed during renovations in the 1960s, the only access was through the original door, mysteriously locked from within. The house loomed against the night sky like a wounded beast, its gabled roof jagged beneath the stars. Paint peeled in long strips, the porch sagging under years of neglect. My flashlight flickered across windows that reflected nothing, black as still water. Mrs. Henderson greeted me at the door, her fingers clutching a steaming ceramic mug. She led me through hallways lined with photographs, sepia faces whose eyes seemed to follow our every move. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet, each step a trespass against the house's long sleep. At the corridor's end stood the locked door, dark wood polished to a mirror sheen, brass doorknob tarnished with verdigris, spreading like rot. I knelt to inspect the lock, fresh scratches circled the keyhole, incongruous against the room's aged decay. The lock was ancient, pre-war, perhaps older, its intricate mechanism more museum relic than functioning hardware. My tools slid into the lock with surprising ease, tumblers clicking softly but echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The door swung open, and my breath caught. The room beyond was not the 1960s bedroom Mrs. Henderson described. Instead, it was a Victorian parlor, gas lamps flickering without visible flames, heavy carved furniture, a horsehair sofa, an ink-laden writing desk. Shelves lined with leather-bound tomes bore titles in languages unrecognizable. The air carried scents that defied time, extinct pipe tobacco, the musty sweetness of old roses, and beneath it all, an indefinable otherness. The moment I stepped fully into the parlor, a chill unlike any winter's cold slithered down my spine. The flickering gas lamps cast wavering shadows that danced eerily across the ornate wallpaper, their soft light revealing details both exquisite and unsettling. The room felt suspended in time, preserved yet impossibly alive, as if the very air held whispers of long-forgotten secrets. I approached the writing desk, the quill still poised delicately above the inkwell, as though awaiting the hand of some unseen author. My fingers brushed against the leather-bound books, their spines cracked and worn, titles etched in alphabets I could neither read nor recognize. The scent of old parchment and something deeper, earthy, almost metallic, hung thick in the air. A sudden flutter caught my attention. On the desk lay a folded letter, yellowed and brittle. Carefully unfolding it, I found words penned in an elegant, looping script. To those who dare disturb this place, beware the watcher beyond the veil. What is sealed may yet seek release. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards beneath me, subtle but insistent, like the heartbeat of the house itself. I glanced toward the tall, shadowed corners where the photographs lined the walls, their eyes seemingly darker now, almost alive. The window panes glistened, though no moonlight or street lamp shone through. Instead, a faint, otherworldly glow pulsed from within the glass itself, an echo, perhaps, of the luminous city beneath Millbrook's waters. My breath hitched as I realized the parlor was no ordinary room, it was a threshold, a gateway between worlds, much like the lake. The sealed door outside was not just physical barricade but a veil between realities. I moved toward the heavy velvet curtains, drawn tight but trembling as if breathing. A soft whisper tickled my ear, unintelligible yet laden with urgency. Goosebumps erupted across my skin as the air grew heavy and cold. Suddenly, the quill lifted slowly, as if guided by invisible fingers, and began to trace words onto a fresh sheet of parchment. The ink flowed like liquid shadow, spelling out a single chilling phrase. The watcher watches still. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I knew I had stepped into a story far darker than any lockout call. A chill ran down my spine, raising the hair on my arms as Mrs. Henderson stepped past me, moving into that impossible room as if it were the most natural place in the world. She approached the writing desk, lifting the quill with the ease and familiarity of someone who had held it countless times before. When she turned, her eyes gleamed with a brightness that hadn't been there moments earlier, a light that unsettled me deeply. She spoke softly, describing the room exactly as she remembered it from childhood visits, though she had long believed it had been converted into a bedroom decades ago. Her words drifted through my mind like smoke, and though every rational part of me screamed in protest, I found myself nodding, caught in the room's inexplicable gravity. I stepped over the threshold, and the temperature dropped sharply, at least 20 degrees. My breath misted in front of me as the gas lamps dimmed in response, their flames flickering uncertainly. The floorboards beneath my boots felt different, older, sturdier, like they'd been laid by hands long turned to dust. Without thinking, my fingers closed around the brass letter opener lying beside the inkwell. It was warm, almost feverish, pulsing faintly like something alive. I slipped it into my pocket, unable to explain why. Mrs. Henderson paid me in crisp bills dated from the 1950s, currency too fresh for their age, and I left her standing in that impossible parlor. When I glanced back down the corridor, the room had reverted, looking exactly like the faded 1960s bedroom she had originally described. 3 days later, the letter opener appeared on my workshop bench. I had no memory of returning it, but this one was different, tarnished black, edges dulled with age, flakes of rust peeling off like old skin. That should have been the warning, a sign to stop, to change my number, to refuse any more midnight calls. But instead, I was drawn in deeper, addicted to the impossible. 2 weeks later, another call, a colonial house on Maple Avenue. The owner was locked out of his study. The door I opened revealed not a modern office, but a 1920s speakeasy, hidden bar, dusty bottles of gin still smelling of illicit distillation. I took a crystal tumbler from the bar. Days later, it appeared in my workshop, cracked and yellowed. Then came the farmhouse on Route 7, where a woman needed access to her late husband's workshop. Behind the locked door, a blacksmith's forge from the 1800s, coals glowing, the phantom ring of hammer on anvil echoing through the silence. A rusted horseshoe from the forge materialized in my shop a week later. Each impossible room was more real than the homes that contained them. And every object I touched aged decades in days, as if time itself flowed backward through my fingers. My reflection in mirrors became unreliable, older in some, younger in others, like glimpses of my displaced selves scattered through time. Clocks ran backward when unobserved. The objects whispered in the quiet, the letter opener murmured forgotten love letters, the crystal tumbler hummed with laughter from Prohibition-era parties, the horseshoe carried memories of long-past carriage rides. Each artifact was a window into vanished lives, trying desperately to tell me something I wasn't yet ready to hear. Sleep slipped away into fractured dreams of endless corridors, doors opening onto unfamiliar yet hauntingly known rooms. I awoke each morning tasting decades-old dust, feeling as though I had wandered through forgotten memories long into the night. Marcus sat hunched over his workbench, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered room. The relics from those impossible rooms lay scattered before him, the tarnished letter opener, the cracked crystal tumbler, the rusted horseshoe, each humming with a silent story he was desperate to understand. He began meticulously cataloging the objects, photographing every detail, tracing the faded inscriptions and patterns that seemed to pulse faintly under his fingertips. Days turned into nights as he scoured libraries and archives, poring over newspapers, diaries, and forgotten town records. Each fragment he uncovered wove threads between the objects and people long vanished, names, dates, tragedies, and whispered secrets that echoed through generations. In one dusty ledger, he found mention of a family that once lived in the Victorian parlour's house, the Carters, whose lineage abruptly ended after a series of mysterious disappearances in the early 1900s. Local folklore spoke of a watcher haunting their home, a presence that bridged worlds and bent time. The letter opener's inscription, he realized, matched the monogram on the Carter's seal. Driven by obsession, Marcus sought out descendants and historians, piecing together accounts that blurred history and myth. He learned of rituals performed to bind restless spirits, warnings carved into wood and stone meant to keep dark forces at bay. The objects in his possession were not mere antiques but vessels, anchors of memories, keys to locked doors between realities. He began experimenting with the objects, holding the letter opener while reciting fragments of incantations from old texts, hoping to unlock their secrets. The crystal tumbler, when filled with water and left under moonlight, cast eerie reflections that shifted and swirled, revealing fleeting images, faces, places, moments frozen in time. With every revelation, the visions grew more vivid, more immersive. He found himself slipping deeper into a twilight world where past and present intertwined, where he could almost walk the shadowed halls of those vanished rooms. Yet, with knowledge came a mounting dread. The Watcher was no mere ghost but a sentinel guarding boundaries Marcus was unraveling, a force that now turned its gaze upon him. His pursuit of truth was no longer academic, it was a perilous journey into a web of time and spirit that threatened to consume him utterly. A shiver raced down my spine, the hairs on my arms rising like tiny sentinels of warning. Mrs. Henderson moved past me, stepping into the impossible room as naturally as if she were returning home after a brief absence. She approached the writing desk and lifted the quill pen, her touch tender and familiar, as if years of memory flooded back in that moment. When she turned to face me again, her eyes held a clarity and brightness that had been absent mere moments before, a light born of deep recognition. She spoke softly, recounting the room as she had known it in childhood visits, certain it had been remodeled into a bedroom decades ago. Her words drifted through my mind like smoke, intangible, elusive, while every rational part of me screamed at the impossibility of it all. Yet, I found myself nodding, pulled into the room's strange gravity. The instant my boot crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted sharply, as if a hidden winter breathed through the air. My breath misted before me, and the gas lamps dimmed, their flames flickering uncertainly, as though shrinking from my presence. The floorboards beneath me felt ancient and solid, as if laid by hands long returned to dust. Without conscious thought, my fingers closed around the brass letter opener resting beside the inkwell. The metal was unnervingly warm, almost feverish, and for a fleeting moment, I swear I felt it pulse with a living heartbeat. Without understanding why, I slipped it into my pocket. Mrs. Henderson thanked me quietly, her payment consisting of crisp cash bearing dates from the 1950s, fresh and untouched by time's usual decay. I left her standing in that impossible parlor and glanced back once from the corridor. The room had shifted, it now resembled precisely the faded 1960s bedroom she'd initially described. 3 days later, the letter opener lay on my workshop bench. I had no memory of placing it there, but this one was not the brass piece I'd taken. It was ancient, tarnished black, its edges dulled by decades of wear. Rust flakes drifted away like discarded skin. That should have been my warning to stop, my moment to change my number, to refuse midnight calls. Instead, I became ensnared, drawn to these impossible homes like a moth to flame. 2 weeks later came another call, a colonial on Maple Avenue. The owner was locked out of his study. The door I opened revealed not a modern office but a 1920s speakeasy, complete with a hidden bar and bottles still fragrant with the bite of illicit gin. I pocketed a crystal tumbler, and days later it appeared cracked and yellowed in my workshop. Then the farmhouse on Route 7, where a woman needed help accessing her late husband's workshop. Behind the locked door was a blacksmith's forge from the 1800s, coals glowing faintly, and the sound of phantom hammer strikes echoed in the stillness. A rusted horseshoe from the forge showed up in my workshop days later, corroded beyond recognition. Each call followed the same pattern. Every impossible room felt more tangible than the houses that contained them, and every object I touched aged decades in mere days, as if time flowed backward through my hands. I noticed other strange things. My reflection in mirrors shifted, older in some, younger in others, as if I glimpsed displaced echoes of myself scattered through different decades. Clocks in my workshop ran backward when I wasn't watching. The objects whispered in the quiet hours, the letter opener murmured forgotten love letters, the crystal tumbler hummed with laughter from long-gone prohibition parties, and the horseshoe carried the rhythmic memories of horses that once pulled carriages along vanished streets. Each artifact was a window into a time that had been, trying desperately to tell me something I wasn't yet prepared to hear. Sleep fractured into endless dreams of corridors stretching beyond reason and doors opening onto rooms unknown but eerily familiar. I awoke each morning tasting decades-old dust and feeling as though I had walked through other people's memories throughout the night. A cold wave crashed through me, the realization striking with brutal clarity, I was part of a cycle older than memory itself, a link in a chain forged across generations. The calls that haunted me were not random but woven into a tapestry of temporal fractures and fading lives. I was no longer just Marcus Webb, locksmith, I was the latest in a lineage of men scattered across time, their fates echoing like ghostly whispers through the decades. My breath hitched as the library's fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting stuttering shadows reminiscent of gas lamps long extinguished. For a heartbeat, I swore I heard the soft scratch of quill on parchment, a sound that had no place in this modern tomb of knowledge. Driving home, the city seemed a shifting mirage, streets warped between past and present, signs flickering with names I didn't know before snapping back to their familiar form. Familiar landmarks warped, aged, or renewed as if the world itself teetered on the edge of a temporal abyss. At my workshop, the objects, those impossible relics, sat like silent sentinels. Their faint glow pulsed with cryptic urgency, whispering secrets I could no longer ignore. The letter opener's call was the loudest, piercing through me with words unspoken but deeply felt. Time, I understood, was no linear path in those haunted houses. Past, present, and future layered like fractured glass. The rooms I had entered were not alternate realities but the same space folded through moments bleeding into each other. Each midnight call peeled away fragments of me, scattering my existence across the decades. Pieces of my soul wandered through the 1920s speakeasy, the 1800s forge, lost among shards of time like broken glass. And those vanished locksmiths, they hadn't disappeared but dissolved across time, eternally bound to their fractured selves, trapped answering phantom calls through the centuries. Then, at 12:52 a.m., the phone rang. The voice was hauntingly familiar yet aged, an older man pleading for help, locked out of his own workshop. The address froze my blood, it was mine. I arrived like a sleepwalker. The building before me was my workshop, but twisted, older, weathered by years I had yet to live. The sign read, Morrison and Sons Emergency Locksmith Services. And waiting there, silhouetted in the dim light, was me, aged by decades, eyes heavy with knowledge and burden. Our gazes met. A collision of past and present. A fractured soul staring into its own echo. The cycle was complete. A sharp contrast to the decay around it, the folder seemed almost out of place, too clean, too new amid decades of forgotten records. I hesitated, fingers hovering above its pristine cover before I dared to lift it. The instant I touched it, a cold pulse shot through my hand, like an electric whisper from a distant time. Opening the folder, I found no patient name or number, just a single sheet of heavy parchment inscribed with cryptic symbols and a date, tomorrow's date. Beneath it, in faint typewriter text, a warning, beware the unseen hand that guides the morrow, destiny is not yet written. My breath caught. How could a document from the future find its way into these ancient archives? The oppressive air thickened, and the buzzing lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that writhed as if alive. Somewhere deep in the basement, I thought I heard the faint scraping of a pen against paper, slow and deliberate, yet no one was there. For 18 years, I had believed my role was to preserve the past, to catalog the histories no one else wanted to touch. But now it seemed the future was being written here, in secret, beneath the hospital's cold stone bones. An invisible author shaping lives through unseen hands. I closed the folder slowly, my heart pounding. The basement's depths suddenly felt alive, watching. Waiting. And I was caught in the middle of a story far larger than myself, a story written not just in ink and paper, but in time itself. The folder's label, Morrison Jennifer DOB 03152026, caught my eye like a flare in the dark. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The date was impossible. We were still in 2024. No one could be born in 2026. My hands trembled as I lifted the folder. It felt unnervingly fresh, crisp, starkly different from the brittle, yellowed papers that crowded the basement shelves. Inside, the pages unfolded like a haunting prophecy, a complete medical record, documented in the hospital's own clinical format. Patient information, medical history, and treatment notes filled with unnerving precision. Jennifer Morrison's birth date remained defiant, March 15, 2026. I flipped through the file, shallow breaths catching in my throat. The diagnosis chilled me: temporal displacement syndrome, a condition unknown to any medical literature I'd encounter. The notes described symptoms that shattered all sense: heightened chronological awareness beyond linear time, cellular aging out of sync with temporal flow. The handwriting shifted throughout the file, as though multiple doctors had recorded their observations across different eras, but the ink was uniform, a fresh blue ballpoint with that unmistakable chemical scent of recent use. My chest tightened with a suffocating weight as I scanned the final entry, dated 3 days ahead of the current date. A follow-up appointment yet to occur, referencing Protocol 7 to Alpha, a treatment plan absent from any current medical database. I set the folder down slowly, palms slick with cold sweat. The basement's temperature dropped noticeably, the air thickening like a shroud. Every sound sharpened: the hum of ventilation, distant water dripping, metal settling with unnerving creaks in the heavy silence. Then my gaze caught the scattered folders sprawled across the sublevel 5 surfaces. Each one bore dates from the near and distant future, pages whispering impossible realities. My legs wobbled as I gathered them with shaking hands, a growing dread knotting my stomach. There was Chin David DOB 0725, a man fated to suffer reality fracture syndrome, plagued by visions of multiple selves in peripheral vision and temporal echoes of unheard conversations. Rodriguez Maria DOB 112024 stopped my breath. The date, November 8, was less than 2 weeks away. The file predicted her arrival at the emergency room, battling acute temporal vertigo and chronological displacement. Each file pressed heavily in my arms, weighted by the impossible futures they foretold. An instinct screamed at me to return them, to flee the basement's suffocating depths and never return. But I was helpless, compelled to read. These conditions defied every principle of medicine and reality: quantum entanglement sickness, parallel existence disorder, causal loop syndrome. Names that sounded ripped from science fiction were catalogued with unerring clinical rigor. I retreated to my office on sublevel 2, body trembling beneath the harsh glare of my desk lamp. The files sprawled out before me spanned days to decades ahead, the most distant, a 2031 case for unknown John, whose wounds healed in reverse, his memory slipping backward through time. In the days that followed, concentration slipped through my fingers. I found myself drawn back again and again to the basement. Each visit revealed new files, new stories, emerging as if written by invisible hands scripting the future. The basement was no longer a repository of the past, it was a crucible where time itself was penned, rewritten, and played out in haunting loops. And I was trapped in its unfolding narrative. Marcus's world began to unravel in the quiet hum of the hospital basement, where impossible future medical records materialized overnight as if penned by unseen hands. The handwriting, once alien, became eerily familiar, mirroring the style of present-day doctors as if the very staff were charting destinies not yet lived, diagnosing ailments still unknown. Sleep eluded him, nights fractured by vivid dreams of endless hospital corridors stretching into infinity. He'd hear the scratch of pens on paper, the soft rustle of pages turning, footsteps echoing softly in empty halls, sounds without sources, whispers of a reality bleeding through time. Then came the most unsettling revelation, a file dated 6 months hence, signed by none other than himself, Dr. M. Webb. The handwriting was his own, aged and trembling. The patient was listed simply as temporal patient, suffering from chronological overflow syndrome, a disorder defying comprehension. Symptoms included awareness of multiple timeline branches and an ability to foresee medical treatments yet to be developed. Treatment notes detailed procedures using futuristic equipment, beyond any current technology. Marginalia, written in his own future hand, revealed a chilling dialogue: the patient recognized the doctor despite it being their first appointment. Concern was expressed over Marcus's own temporal stability. His hands shook violently as he clutched the folder, the basement seemed alive, pulsing with dread and possibility. The buzzing fluorescent lights intensified into a discordant symphony, rattling his skull. Rational explanations fled. pranks, logical glitches. None fit the precise, authentic details, the medical terminology, procedural logic, all consistent with a future that beckoned inexorably. Outside, the weather mirrored his turmoil, gray skies wept intermittent rain against grimy windows like skeletal fingers. Marcus found himself tethered to the basement, unwilling to leave his growing cache of prophetic files. Dr. Helen Park, his supervisor, voiced concern over his exhaustion, but he offered only vague excuses. Who would believe the truth? That medical record scripted the future. That patients unborn were documented with chilling accuracy. Yet, evidence mounted. New files arrived nightly. His meticulous logs revealed a pattern. These patients, linked inexorably to the hospital, suffered from temporal disturbances and fractured reality perception. It seemed the hospital was fated to treat those unraveling under the weight of time itself. On November 8, the prophecy manifested. Maria Rodriguez arrived in the ER, disoriented and nauseated. Heart pounding, Marcus ascended to witness the unfolding. Through the emergency door's small window, he saw the young woman, exactly as described. Dr. Sarah Kim, the attending, explained, patient reports feeling disconnected from linear time perception, mirroring the words Marcus had read weeks before. A chilling confirmation, the future was arriving, and Marcus stood at its trembling edge. The words echoed in my mind, complaints of seeing events before they happen, bouts of vertigo when focusing on the present. The weight of it struck me like a physical blow. My legs buckled, forcing me to grasp the cold wall to steady myself. These files weren't predictions or fabrications, they were real medical records, somehow sent backward through time from futures bleeding into the present. I stumbled toward the elevator, vision blurring at the edges as if reality itself was fraying. The descent to sublevel 5 felt like falling through layers of existence, each floor plunging me deeper into an impossible truth. When the doors parted, dozens more files lay scattered across tables and shelves, white markers like tombstones signaling futures yet to be lived. I moved mechanically, gathering folders filled with records of patients arriving next week, next month, next year. All suffered from temporal displacement, distorted reality perception, and unstable chronology. This hospital was no longer a mere medical facility. According to these documents, it was evolving into a sanctuary, a refuge for minds unraveling beneath the crushing weight of time itself. Later files, dated years into the future, detailed new departments, temporal medicine, chronological psychiatry, reality stabilization therapy. Marginal notes referenced St. Bartholomew's temporal anomaly, identifying the hospital as a nexus for time-related medical crises. Patients traveled nationwide, seeking treatment for conditions mainstream medicine dismissed as delusions. The most recent folder chilled me to the core. Web, Marcus DOB 04121976, my own record, dated 3 days ahead. Inside lay clinical documentation of my admission to the psychiatric ward for acute temporal awareness syndrome and chronological integration disorder. The attending physician's notes were detached, clinical. Patient exhibits obsessive behavior focused on future medical records. Reports ability to read documents of events yet to occur. Recommend immediate intervention for temporal psychosis. The treatment plan prescribed sedation, counseling, and Chronodol, a new medication designed to stabilize temporal perception and halt further chronological displacement. At the bottom of the last page, penned in shaky, aged handwriting I recognized as my own, was a desperate note. They're trying to make me forget, but the files keep appearing. Someone has to document them. Someone has to bear witness. The future is bleeding backward, and we're the only ones who know. My hands went numb as I set the folder down. The basement itself seemed alive, shifting and breathing, as if responding to the temporal rift contained within its concrete walls. Above, the fluorescent lights flickered rhythmically, syncing with my heartbeat, creating a strobe effect that made reality wobble and fracture. That night, I returned to my small apartment and sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the clock's hands spinning forward with cruel, mechanical precision. But I sensed something deeper, a feeling of watching time from outside, perceiving seconds and minutes as fragile segments of a vast, terrifying enigma. The next morning, I called in sick. I couldn't face work. Instead, I buried myself in research, diving into temporal physics and theories on time perception. Most papers were dense, mathematical labyrinths beyond my grasp, but buried within were hints, chronological feedback loops, temporal information transfer, concepts suggesting that, under certain conditions, information could indeed travel backward through time. I found case studies of people claiming to see the future or feel disconnected from the linear flow of time. Most were labeled delusional, subjected to treatments aiming to suppress their hallucinations. But deep down, I knew they were closer to the truth than anyone dared admit. The silence on Highway 67 was absolute, an emptiness stretched thin across the desert, cracked asphalt fading into shimmering mirages that teased the horizon like phantoms. My garage, a weathered concrete bunker at mile marker 143, sat amid rusted car parts and skeletal shells of vehicles that never made it back home. The faded sign above the door read Eddie's Auto Repair, in peeling red letters, ignored, like so many things around here, left to crumble into dust. I'd been grinding away at this stretch of forgotten nowhere for 12 years, ever since Sarah left, taking with her everything I'd ever cared about. The isolation fit me like an old coat. Most days, only a handful of cars would trudge past, half of them barely needing a jump start or a patch. I was a ghost in this forgotten patch of earth, quietly fixing what was broken without asking questions. But the thing about silence out here, it never truly hides everything. Beneath the stillness, there's a pulse, a rhythm you can feel in your bones if you listen closely. Something ancient and watching. The work was honest, steady, an anchor against the memories I tried so hard to avoid. But 3 weeks ago, something shifted. That morning, I sat nursing my second cup of coffee, black and bitter, like motor oil, when the familiar rumble of an engine drew my gaze outside. Through the grimy window of my office, a car rolled onto my lot, and my blood ran ice cold. A cherry-red 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, gleaming as if freshly minted. Chrome bumpers that caught the desert sun like polished mirrors. White wall tires so pristine they looked untouched by time. I hadn't seen a car like that since 1957. My hands trembled as I set down the coffee mug. The sharp clink echoed in the sudden hush. My heart pounded thunderously against my ribs. The driver stepped out, a man in his 30s, clad in a perfectly pressed suit from another era. Wide lapels, a narrow tie, the kind of style you'd find in old Hollywood reels. His hair slicked back with pomade, and when he smiled, his teeth were unnervingly white, flawless. I forced myself outside, legs weak beneath me. The desert heat slammed my face like a furnace blast, but cold sweat trickled down my spine. He explained his car's problem, a strange noise, a carburetor running rich. His voice was smooth, conversational, yet something about his cadence was off, like a line memorized long ago. When he handed me his business card, the paper felt wrong, too thick, textured like parchment. I popped the hood. The engine bay gleamed immaculate, every part untouched by wear. I listened carefully, hearing a subtle irregularity in the idle, a fixable issue, maybe an hour's work. I quoted the price. He reached into a leather wallet bulging with bills. As he counted out 20s and 10s, my skin crawled. The notes were crisp and new, but the designs were vintage. Serial numbers formed patterns I'd only seen in my grandfather's coin collection. I told him the car would be ready by evening. He nodded, shook my hand, his fingers ice-cold despite the desert heat, and walked away. His polished shoes clicked against asphalt until the heat shimmer swallowed him whole. The repair took exactly 47 minutes. I replaced a worn gasket, adjusted the carburetor, and ran the engine until it purred like a contented cat. Then I waited. As the sun set, painting the sky blood red, he returned, appearing from the heat waves like a mirage, solid and unchanged, suit pristine, that perfect smile intact. He paid me with more of those strange bills, thanked me politely, and drove away. Something deep told me I'd never see that car again. I was wrong. 2 days later, the cherry red Bel Air rolled in again. Same immaculate condition. Same impossibly perfect man. My vision blurred at the edges. He wore the same suit, spoke the same words about the carburetor. My hands shook, barely able to hold my tools. The repair took 47 minutes. As before, he appeared at sunset, paid with identical bills in the same sequence, and vanished into the night. By the third time, I'd started a journal. The pattern never varied. His shadow fell wrong, too short, too dark. Birds fell silent when he arrived. The air grew thick, oppressive. And I realized, this was no ordinary man. Something ancient, something not quite human, had come calling on Highway 67. The digital clock on my workbench began skipping forward during those visits, minutes vanishing into thin air, leaving me grappling with lost time I couldn't explain. But the cherry red Bel Air wasn't alone. A week after the first encounter, a midnight blue 1949 Mercury coupe rolled onto my lot. The driver, a woman in a flower print dress and victory rolls, spoke of transmission troubles in a voice that seemed to bubble up from underwater depths. She paid me with silver dollars, heavy, cold coins that felt impossibly dense in my palm, and left behind a faint scent of jasmine and decay, a lingering perfume of time displaced. Then came a 1963 Ford Galaxy, tail fins like gleaming chrome rockets, driven by a man in a narrow-brimmed hat who spoke with the measured cadence of a Kennedy-era radio announcer. A 1955 Packard Caribbean, its leather seats creaking fresh from the factory. A 1941 Buick Super, its engine knocking like a death rattle. Each car was flawless, pristine beyond reason. Each driver polite but wrong, paying with currency that should have vanished with their eras and speaking in patterns too rehearsed, like actors trapped in a script they couldn't escape. The timeline never shifted, 47 minutes to repair, pickup at sunset, payment in obsolete money, and departure into the gathering darkness. I dreaded the sound of engines roaring down the highway. Sleep fled me, replaced by nightmares of polished chrome and acrid exhaust. I'd wake gasping, taste of motor oil thick on my tongue, the roar of vintage engines echoing relentlessly in my ears. By day, I obsessed over the calendar, desperately trying to anchor myself in the present, but the dates swam and warped before my eyes. The silence between visits was worse, cavernous, oppressive. The garage filled with shifting shadows that slithered just beyond my focus. I caught glimpses of a figure in an old suit, a flash of chrome, a ghostly wisp of cigarette smoke vanishing when I turned my head. My hands trembled constantly. Tools slipped from my grasp, coffee spilled on workbenches, simple repairs faltered. Regular customers voiced concern, but how could I explain this creeping madness? 3 weeks in, I decided to break the cycle. When the Bel Air came for its 8th visit, I refused to fix it. I told the driver parts were on order, to come back tomorrow. His perfect smile faltered for a flicker, a crack revealing something vast and hungry beneath the polished facade. He left silently, footsteps clicking down the highway like a death knell. That night, the Bel Air's engine idled outside my trailer for hours. Its V8 rumbled smooth and deep, headlights casting eerie pale circles on curtained windows. I lay frozen in bed, muscles taut with terror, listening to the impossible engine and wondering what awaited if I dared to look outside. By morning, the car was gone. But so was something else. My reflection in the bathroom mirror had changed. The face was mine, but the eyes held an alien depth, as if hollowed out and occupied by something else. My skin looked waxy, unnatural. Touching my cheek, the coldness seeped into my bones. Despite the rising desert heat, the vintage cars ceased their visits. Highway 67 fell silent for 3 days, only the occasional modern vehicle passed without stopping. I should have felt relief. Instead, a suffocating wrongness settled like a shroud. The garage felt too still, the air heavy and unmoving. Even the desert wind held its breath. On the 4th morning, horror seized me. Flipping through my appointment book, I saw entries for those vintage visits, but written in my own hand, or so it seemed. The handwriting was too precise, too deliberate, like a ghost copying my penmanship without grasping its rhythm or soul. I flipped through page after page. Every appointment. Every repair note. Every impossible detail of those visits meticulously documented in this careful, uncanny mimicry of my own writing. The line between my reality and something else had blurred irreversibly. And at the bottom of the last page, glowing with a dark, pulsing light, was a chilling message: "Welcome to the loop." That was when the crushing truth settled over me like a suffocating fog. The vintage cars hadn't stopped visiting because I broke the pattern. No, they stopped because I had become part of it. I was no longer just Eddie, the lonely mechanic, I was the ghost haunting this garage. I don't know when it happened, during which visit, which repair, what fleeting touch between me and those impossible vehicles and their timeless drivers, but somewhere amid those weeks of mounting dread, I crossed a threshold. A line I could never uncross. Now, I wait. I keep the garage spotless, the tools polished, the coffee brewed hot. Soon, someone new will drive down Highway 67. They'll see the worn sign, the peeling paint, the unassuming building. They'll trust me with their modern cars, expect routine fixes, and I'll oblige with polite professionalism. But I'll watch, study how they move, how they speak, how they anchor themselves in their solid, linear time. Because eventually, one of them will be perfect. One will fit. And when that happens, when I find the right soul to inherit this endless, choking loop, I will finally be free. Drive away down Highway 67 into the unknown beyond this purgatory of chrome and gasoline. Until then, I wait. I watch. I listen for engines on the horizon. The faded sign still reads Eddie's Auto Repair. But sometimes, when the desert sun blurs reality in the heat shimmer, you might glimpse other words bleeding through, older words whispering of services no living person should ever need. If you ever find yourself on Highway 67, if your car breaks down near mile marker 143, if you see my garage flickering in the heat like a mirage come to life, keep driving. Whatever you do, keep driving. Because some loops are never meant to be broken, only passed on. Story 8. Reality hums with a frequency, and mine began glitching sharply at exactly 2:22 a.m. At first, I blamed faulty equipment. After 23 years of digital terrain mapping, working for oil companies, construction firms, I knew how often technology deceives. Lies masquerading as truth, especially when probing the Earth's hidden layers. But this was different. Too consistent. Too deliberate. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've spent years translating Earth's secrets into streams of ones and zeros. The Blackwood Valley project started like any other. A private collector bought thousands of acres of virgin Oregon woodland, convinced it concealed pre-Columbian settlements. He hired me to map every inch beneath the canopy, scanning for buried ruins, pottery shards, ancient tools. Standard archaeological reconnaissance. I set up my mobile command center, a converted RV bristling with computers, satellite uplinks, and ground-penetrating radar capable of piercing 50 feet of solid rock. Isolated, with no interference, just me and the machines, my eyes beneath the Earth's skin. The first week was normal. Daytime scans showed familiar geology, topsoil, clay, bedrock dating millions of years back. No sign of human hands. But I've learned the Earth hides its deepest secrets in darkness. True discoveries come when atmospheric conditions align, temperature contrasts peak for thermal imaging, and absent solar interference lets radar penetrate with surgical precision. The rational part of me yearned to explain it away, but the deeper I stared into the darkness, the more I felt the impossible encroaching on reality. The forest around me was unnaturally still, as if the very air had thickened, waiting. My flashlight's beam dimmed inexplicably, though the battery indicator read full. The usual comforting pulse of my own heartbeat vanished from sound, even as its furious thuds rattled inside my chest like a trapped drum. Time itself felt unmoored, stretching and bending in ways that mocked every law I thought immutable. I spent those 40 minutes in that small clearing, an island of nothingness surrounded by ancient trees, recording every flicker of sensation, every hint of movement, every breath drawn in a silence that was almost sacred. No structures appeared, no heat signatures danced on my instruments, no lights blinked or shifted. Only the profound awareness that something beyond understanding hovered at the edge of perception. When I finally left, the forest seemed to exhale, and the normal sounds of night creatures slowly returned, distant owls, the rustling of nocturnal life. Back at my command center, the scans replayed precisely as they had before, showing the 3 buildings appearing and disappearing like ghosts tethered to a moment in time. The movements within them followed their perfect, endless geometry, immutable and unknowable. I knew then, the earth was speaking in a language I barely understood. And I was just beginning to listen. The absence of any visible sign only deepened the enigma. My instruments, cold, unerring machines, insisted that dozens of warm bodies moved in intricate patterns all around me, yet my eyes saw nothing but empty forest and moonlit shadows. Driving back to my command center, the first seeds of genuine fear took root. This wasn't the clinical curiosity or professional concern that had driven me this far, but a raw, primal unease seeping into my bones like a creeping chill. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting repeatedly to the rearview mirror, always empty, yet I couldn't stop checking. That night, I obsessed over every calibration, every technical parameter, desperate to uncover an error that might reconcile the discord between machine and reality. But every test confirmed the same haunting truth: my scanning array functioned flawlessly, capturing thermal signatures of large, complex structures inhabited by numerous moving entities, structures utterly invisible to my senses. Days passed, and my professional confidence frayed. I'd built my life on the assumption that technology revealed what was hidden. Now I confronted data suggesting reality obeyed unknown laws, rules that allowed solid buildings to exist in one dimension while slipping completely unseen in another. Sleep became elusive. Every night, my automated scans confirmed the spectral structure's presence. Every night, I tried and failed to witness them firsthand. The mental toll mounted, layer upon layer of baffling experiences eroding the foundations of what I believed about perception and measurement. By the 3rd week, new anomalies surfaced. The heat signatures grew more dynamic, tracing spirals and looping paths with no discernible purpose. The entities themselves seemed to swell, their thermal footprints expanding from human size to something far more immense. Equipment began betraying me, batteries drained inexplicably fast, files corrupted without warning, hours of work vanished into digital voids. Worse still, timestamps on my scans drifted, as though time itself bent and wavered near the anomaly. The breaking point arrived in the 4th week when the 2:22 a.m. phenomena were no longer confined to one spot. The original triangular cluster remained, but new structures bloomed at scattered coordinates, up to a dozen sites simultaneously manifesting and fading on their precise 30-minute cycles. The scale of this spread was staggering, something alive, growing, entrenching itself in a realm just beyond human sight. If these buildings truly existed yet were invisible, what did that mean for reality? How many parallel worlds brushed against ours, separated only by a fragile veil between thermal and visual perception? In my obsession, I became reckless. Night after night, I raced from site to site, hiking miles through tangled forest under the moon, hauling scanning gear in desperate pursuit of confirmation. The physical exhaustion was punishing. But the psychological strain was worse. I began to fracture, experiencing disorienting moments of dissociation, my sense of self splintering like fragile glass. The world around me felt unmoored, slipping between layers I could barely comprehend. My eyes betrayed me, unable to reconcile what the scanner displayed with the empty clearing I physically occupied. Standing there, I faced a cruel cognitive dissonance. The machine painted a bustling temple of light and heat, but all I could see was the stillness of shadowed trees. My sense of space warped, paths I'd traversed countless times now twisted into unfamiliar routes, and landmarks shifted like ghosts between visits. The isolation deepened the fracture within me. 3 weeks without a human voice but my own left me conjuring conversations with the machines, spinning theories of parallel worlds and temporal fractures that would sound mad to any outsider. Yet, out here, with no signal for miles, these thoughts were my only company. In a rare moment of clarity amid the unraveling, I saw the pattern anew. The heat movements weren't random or mere geometry, they were ritualistic, a dance performed with purpose and precision. These weren't aimless wanderers but participants in ceremonies beyond my reality's grasp. Suddenly, I wasn't just a passive observer but an unwilling witness, maybe even a player, in their sacred rites. I began to wonder, did my presence disrupt their delicate balance? Were these ceremonies a reaction to me? More chillingly, was their influence now seeping into me? The climax came on my final night in Blackwood Valley. Armed with every piece of portable scanning gear I had, I set up a makeshift command post right at the heart of the original triangle. As 2:22 a.m. drew near, something unprecedented appeared on the thermal display. One heat signature detached from the ritual procession and moved deliberately toward me, a towering form, nearly 8 feet tall, radiating intense warmth far beyond human limits, crossing what should have been solid walls. My eyes saw nothing but forest shadows. My heart pounded as the figure's heat blazed closer on the screen. Panic and fascination warred within me, but my feet remained rooted. The entity stopped 10 feet away, silent and watchful, circling me with an eerie grace that mirrored the patterns etched into my logs. In that suspended moment, I grasped the staggering truth: these beings transcended the boundaries of their invisible sanctuaries, walking freely through the fabric of what I called reality. From the beginning, they had known I was here. Their nightly rituals weren't just ceremonies, they were responses to my gaze, adapting to my intrusion. I was no longer detached. I had become part of the very enigma I sought to unravel. Then, as the clock struck 2:52 a.m., my scanner's battery expired, silencing the last trace of their spectral dance. The night swallowed the clearing whole. And I was left alone with the echoes of a world unseen, forever changed by what I had glimpsed. The weight of that realization pressed on me, heavier than the watch itself. This was no mere quirk of craftsmanship, it was a deliberate defiance of time's very nature, a mechanical rebellion against the forward march everyone else took for granted. My hands trembled as I held the watch under the flickering lamp, the backward ticking filling the silence like a heartbeat running against the flow of life. The brass gleamed faintly in the dim light, but the warmth it should have radiated was absent, replaced by a chilling coolness that seeped into my skin. I tried to focus, to dismantle the mechanism with the precision honed over 3 decades, but the watch seemed to resist, each component locking into place as if guarding a secret too profound for me to unravel. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, the air around me shifted. The usual creaks of the workshop faded into a void, replaced by a deep silence so complete it felt like the world itself had paused to listen. Suddenly, a whisper slipped through the stillness, a voice not spoken aloud but echoed inside my mind. A soft murmur of names and dates, promises and warnings, stretching backward and forward in time. I glanced around, half expecting to see Mrs. Henderson still standing at the door, but the workshop was empty save for the ghostly tick of the reversed watch. In the days that followed, I became consumed. The watch's backward rhythm haunted my thoughts, each tick unraveling the threads of my own sense of time. Dreams bled into waking moments, visions of people I'd never met, living lives I'd never lived, their fates intertwined with the watch's mysterious journey through the past. Visitors to the workshop noticed my distracted gaze, the occasional tremor in my hands as I absent-mindedly traced the watch's face. Yet I couldn't share the truth, this was no ordinary timepiece. It was a nexus of past and future, a mechanical key to something vast and unknowable. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the brass gears and winding springs, a secret waited, a story written in reverse, calling me to follow its ticking footsteps backward through the corridors of time itself. A strange exhilaration mingled with the dread rising in my chest. The watch was no longer a mere object, it was a catalyst, unraveling the relentless march of time itself around me. But with each tick in reverse, I felt myself slipping, losing not only the years etched on my skin but the solidity of who I was. The workshop, once a sanctuary of routine and craft, grew strange and alien. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, the faint glow of the watch casting eerie reflections that danced like specters across the walls. The air felt charged, electric, as if I had opened a door that was meant to remain sealed. I knew I was racing against something, time itself, or whatever force governed this unholy reversal. But the lure was irresistible. I was addicted to the glimpse of youth regained, the promise of years peeled back like the pages of an ancient book. Yet, beneath the surface of rejuvenation, I sensed a darker truth. The backward ticking wasn't just healing, it was unmaking. With every vanished wrinkle, every restored breath of vitality, I feared I was erasing pieces of my soul, unraveling the very thread of my existence. And the watch, cold and relentless, kept ticking backward, a hypnotic drumbeat dragging me deeper into a labyrinth where time folded upon itself, and the line between past and present blurred into oblivion. The air in the workshop was thick with tension as I faced the choice that stretched before me like an endless corridor of fading light. The watch ticked in reverse, its insidious rhythm echoing in my ears, a hypnotic chant urging surrender. But beneath the surface of that seductive promise lay a cold, merciless truth: this was not restoration, but erasure. I reached out with trembling hands, the youthful reflection in the watch's crystal now a stranger's face, unmoored from the weight of years and memories. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a chorus of lost souls calling me to abandon my tether to reality. Come back, they pleaded, to the time before pain, before loss. Yet I knew that to accept was to dissolve. To become a hollow echo, a ghost drifting in a timeless void where existence is a fragile shadow. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the reality I still clung to, the worn tools on my bench, the scent of oil and metal, the dim light filtering through dusty windows. With a resolve born from desperation, I lifted the watch and studied its delicate, cursed mechanism. Each gear spun backwards with elegant cruelty, but this time, I saw not just a machine, but a prison I must dismantle. Slowly, carefully, I began to loosen screws, reverse the coils of spring, to unravel the dark enchantment embedded in brass and glass. The whispers faltered, the seductive voices wavered as if sensing their hold slipping. The backward ticking slowed, then faltered, and finally ceased, leaving a silence heavier than the ticking had ever been. My reflection returned, older, wiser, worn but whole. The shadows in the workshop seemed to retreat, and for the first time in days, the weight pressing against my chest lifted. But I knew this victory was fragile, a single act against a relentless force. The watch, now silent, sat cold and inert, yet its hunger had not vanished. Somewhere deep within its core, the promise of stolen time still pulsed, waiting for the next keeper, the next soul to weave into its endless, backwards dance. I placed the watch in a locked box, binding it with chains and old warding symbols I'd scrawled from forgotten texts. The box I buried deep beneath the floorboards of my workshop, beneath layers of concrete and time. But sometimes, in the stillness of night, when the world seems to hold its breath, I swear I hear the faint tick of a clock moving backward, echoing from below, a haunting reminder that some things, once awakened, never truly rest. The ringing persisted, a cruel insistence that filled the empty studio with a spectral urgency. My fingers hovered above the receiver as if touching it might invite something I was desperate to avoid. Yet the sound demanded a response, a summons I couldn't refuse despite the chill crawling down my spine. I lifted the handset with trembling hands, and silence greeted me. No voice, no static, only a hollow stillness that pressed in on my senses like a vacuum. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a whisper slipped through the line. A voice, faint and cracked, but unmistakably human. "Marcus, they're listening, the fog is coming." The line went dead. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I set the phone down gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile connection that had just flickered out of existence. The fog outside thickened, curling tendrils pressing against the glass, hiding the world beyond the window in a milky void. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, the studio speakers crackled, and an ancient melody filled the room, something both haunting and familiar, yet impossible to place. The sound seemed to ripple through the very walls, tugging at memories I didn't know I had. I reached for the broadcast mic, the one I'd used to share stories, songs, and solace in the darkest hours. But now, it felt like a conduit to another realm. The fog seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around my heart, and the voice on the other end whispered again. Not all signals come from here. Not all voices speak for the living. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The studio was no longer a place of comfort but a threshold, a fragile border between what is known and what lurks beyond perception. And somewhere in the silence that followed, I realized that my role was not yet finished. The night still needed a voice. Even if the world had moved on, even if the station lay in darkness, the echoes remained, waiting to be heard. I leaned in close to the microphone, my voice low and steady, ready to carry the stories of those lost between the static and the silence, the living and the forgotten. Good evening, listeners. If you can hear me, you're not alone. The voices came not just from the past or present, but from the deep recesses of my soul, places I thought I had sealed away forever. Each call peeled back layers of armor I had built around myself, exposing wounds I had learned to hide beneath smiles and routine. The red light on the phone pulsed like a heartbeat in the darkened booth, a sinister metronome counting down to something inevitable. I tried to speak, to demand answers, to anchor myself in reason, but my voice felt fragile, swallowed by the overwhelming flood of memories and confessions that poured from the receiver. The lines between what was real and what was spectral blurred. I was no longer a broadcaster, I had become the broadcast, a living archive of pain and hope, of moments I had lived and moments I had never dared to face. Suddenly, a new voice, neither friend nor foe, whispered through the static, softer than a sigh yet more commanding than a shout. You carry their stories now, Marcus. The night has chosen its keeper. A chill ran down my spine. I realized then that the silence of WXKM was not empty, it was waiting. Waiting for me to become more than a voice on the air, to become a guardian of the fragile threads that bind the living to their memories and the departed to their echoes. I sat back in the worn leather chair, the weight of countless untold stories pressing upon me. And as the fog outside thickened, wrapping the world in a shroud of mystery, I whispered into the microphone. This is Marcus Webb, still here, still listening. To those who call from the shadows, you are not forgotten. The red light flickered once more, then held steady, an eternal flame in the night. A low, insistent hum, vibrating just beneath the surface, the sound of countless lost souls tuning into a frequency only I could reach. It whispered secrets not meant for human ears, weaving a tapestry of grief, hope, and endless waiting. I realized then that I was no longer merely the voice of the night, I had become the conduit for those caught between moments, their stories trapped in the static between worlds. The hum swelled into a chorus of distant cries and whispered names, a spectral audience filling the empty studio with their presence. As the red light above flickered faster, shadows flickered across the walls, dancing to a rhythm older than time itself. My fingers, moving of their own accord, adjusted the dials and sliders, guiding this invisible broadcast through the ether. In that suspended moment, I understood, WXKM wasn't dead. It had merely transformed. I was the keeper of its flame, the last thread holding its signal alive across the void. And as dawn threatened the horizon, I leaned into the microphone, voice steady but filled with a fragile resolve, and spoke softly into the night. You are heard. You are not alone. This frequency carries your stories, your truths, and I will not let them fade away. The hum settled into a gentle pulse, a heartbeat syncing with my own. Outside, the fog began to lift, but inside the booth, the night's broadcast continued, eternal, unbroken, and alive. The static on some of the monitors pulsed softly, like the slow breathing of a slumbering beast. Occasionally, a flicker of movement would ripple across the screens, just a shadow, a shifting shape, but every time I'd check in person, there was nothing. Just peeling paint, broken glass crunching underfoot, the cold bite of forgotten metal. On my third night, the silence fractured. I was in the central hub when the power flickered, plunging the entire building into darkness for a heartbeat before the emergency lights kicked in, casting the corridors in an eerie red glow. The monitors went blank. A cold draft swept through the hallways, carrying with it the faintest echo of voices, soft murmurs that danced on the edge of hearing. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the shadows. Moving toward the source of the sound, I found the rec room, the last place I expected to hear anything but silence. The old radio perched on a shelf crackled with static, then burst into a scratchy tune from a bygone era, one that the building's walls must have absorbed long ago. A woman's laughter echoed faintly, mingling with the music, fragile and distant. I felt a weight settle on my chest, the air thick with memories not my own. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Trapped in that crimson-lit room, the whispered voices swelled into a chorus, a litany of regrets, lost hopes, and forgotten names. Faces flickered in the shadows, prisoners long gone, guards long retired, their stories woven into the very mortar and steel. And in that moment, I understood. Millfield wasn't just decaying. It was remembering. Holding on to every life it had ever contained, every soul who had walked its halls. The building was a vessel for ghosts not content to fade quietly, but determined to echo until someone listened. As I stood in that rec room, surrounded by the murmurs of the past, I realized my watch was ticking differently, slower, deeper, as if the prison itself had bent time around its broken heart. Outside, the night pressed in, vast and endless. And inside Millfield, the ghosts waited. The static hissed in my ear, a chaotic symphony that sometimes seemed to form words, urgent, desperate, and fragmented. I pressed the transmit button again, voice barely audible over the crackle, but no response came. The silence that followed was heavier than the void itself. The cold of the basement corridors seeped into my bones, each step echoing hollowly against concrete walls. I found myself drawn back towards cell block C, the source of the most persistent audio anomalies. The flickering emergency lights cast long, trembling shadows, and the air smelled faintly of damp stone and forgotten sorrow. I paused outside cell 312, where the whispers had seemed most insistent. The door, though marked as sealed, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me inward. My heart hammered, but something deeper than fear urged me forward. Inside, the silence was overwhelming. No voices, no footsteps, only the cold breath of a place left to rot. But as I stood there, my flashlight beam caught a subtle shimmer on the floor, an iridescent thread stretched taut across the threshold. It pulsed faintly, almost alive, and when I reached out to touch it, a sudden jolt surged through my fingers, freezing me in place. Visions flashed unbidden, snatches of conversations, fleeting images of faces worn with regret, and a mounting sense of unresolved torment. I staggered back, breathing ragged, but the thread lingered in my mind like a tether pulling me deeper into the prison's hidden past. The following nights blurred into one another. More personal items appeared, letters yellowed with age, a locket engraved with initials long forgotten, a cracked photograph capturing a moment of stolen joy amid despair. Each artifact felt charged with the weight of lives trapped between time and memory. And the voices persisted. Sometimes clear, sometimes fractured, always close yet unreachable. They told stories of betrayal and forgiveness, of love lost and revenge sought, of prisoners who never truly left and guards who bore their own ghosts. I became a reluctant confidant to these echoes, a sentinel standing watch over the lingering spirits. My own reflection grew paler, my nights shorter, and the boundary between past and present thinned like fragile glass. One evening, as the crimson glow bathed the rec room once more, I heard a new sound, a soft, deliberate knock at the security office door. I hesitated, then opened it to find no one. Only a single sheet of paper pinned to the frame, inscribed with a message in elegant script. To those who remember, the past is never silent. Listen well, for forgiveness is the key to peace. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my pocket. Somewhere within Millfield's shadowed halls, the echoes waited, unfinished stories yearning for resolution. And I was caught in their midst, bound to guard a place where time itself held its breath, haunted by the whispered pleas of those who could not move on. Or maybe I was simply unraveling, the isolation and eerie echoes warping my perception. But deep down, a darker truth gnawed at me, that the prison itself was alive in a way I couldn't understand, a sentient shell refusing to surrender its ghosts. One evening, as I sat reviewing security footage in the dim glow of the monitors, a flicker caught my eye. In cell block D, a shadow moved, too fluid, too swift to be human. The camera feed blurred and distorted, the video freezing for several seconds before snapping back to the empty corridor I'd seen countless times before. My heart pounded as I rewound the tape, watching the moment again and again. The figure seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, its form shifting between solidity and mist, disappearing and reappearing like a fading dream. I tried to trace its path through the halls, but the cameras offered no answers, just endless emptiness interrupted by brief, inexplicable flashes. That night, the audio grew louder. Whispers threading through the static, fragments of conversations half remembered but never complete. They spoke in hushed tones of regret and repentance, pleading for release, forgiveness. The prison was not just a place of confinement for the living but a liminal realm where memories and spirits lingered, trapped between worlds. Sleep became elusive. Every creak and groan in the building morphed into voices calling my name, urging me to listen, to remember, to understand. I found myself wandering the corridors at odd hours, drawn toward cell 247, the place where the wedding ring had first appeared. There, I knelt and whispered into the darkness, hoping for answers that never came, feeling the weight of countless unseen eyes. Each night, the boundary between past and present blurred further. I began seeing fleeting reflections in broken glass, faces from another time, pleading silently for recognition. The cold seeped deeper into my bones, and the silence pressed heavier on my soul. Yet amidst the dread, a fragile hope took root. The note pinned to the rec room door, "For those who remain, forgiveness is the only escape," haunted me like a mantra. Perhaps by bearing witness, by listening without fear, I could help these restless echoes find peace. Perhaps by embracing the ghosts instead of fleeing them, the prison would finally breathe its last and I could finally be free. But for now, I am the sentinel in this forgotten fortress, the keeper of whispered stories and unfinished farewells. And in the deep, endless night, I hold fast to the fragile thread between memory and oblivion, hoping that one day, the voices will grow silent and the shadows will rest at last. The entry unsettled me beyond words, as if the prison itself was rewriting reality around me. Who was this guard Mitchell, shadowing my every move, performing duties I couldn't recall? Was I losing time? Or was something else slipping through the cracks of my consciousness, masquerading as me? Desperate for answers, I retraced my steps through the corridors, searching for any sign that might explain the discrepancy. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a jittery glow that made the shadows dance unnaturally. The silence weighed heavy, broken only by the faint mechanical hum of security cameras and the distant drip of water echoing in the underground halls. In one empty cell, I found a scrap of paper taped to the wall, a handwritten note, aged but legible: "We are watching. We are waiting. The line between is thin." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the message was meant not for me, but for the presence that haunted this place, or perhaps for someone like me, caught in the liminal space between the living and the forgotten. That night, as I sat alone in the security office, the monitors suddenly flickered to life. Dozens of black and white images filled the screens, each showing ghostly figures moving through the prison's halls, walking, talking, living moments that should have been long past. Their faces blurred, expressions lost to time, but their presence was undeniable. A soft whisper seeped through the speakers, barely audible at first, then growing louder, fragments of conversation, pleas for release, names called out in longing. I realized then that Millfield Correctional Facility was more than abandoned concrete, it was a vessel for memories, echoes, and souls trapped in an endless loop. My reflection in the darkened window was no longer my own but fragmented, a mosaic of faces and expressions, all waiting to be remembered, to be freed. I understood then that I was no longer merely a guard. I had become the last sentinel of a prison where time had ceased to move, where the living and the dead coexisted in uneasy harmony. And as the first light of dawn seeped through cracked windows, I vowed to remain, to bear witness to the stories whispered in the dark, until the building finally found peace, or I became another ghost within its walls. The weight of the words settled heavily in my chest, each syllable echoing through the vast emptiness as if the very walls were breathing in unison with my voice. I could feel the unseen crowd leaning in, their collective gaze burning into me, waiting for my next word, my next breath, as though the act of reading had bound me irrevocably to their presence. My voice trembled despite my best efforts to maintain composure. The speech spoke of closure, of release, a farewell to a place that had held countless souls captive in life and in memory. Yet beneath the formal tone lay an unspoken truth. This was a ritual of passage, an invitation to cross the threshold between watcher and participant, between the living and the lingering. As I finished the final line, the silence that followed was not empty but charged. A profound stillness, vibrating with unseen energy, settled over the hall like a shroud. My hands dropped the paper, and the echoes of my reading faded into the void, swallowed by shadows that seemed to pulse with life. Suddenly, a faint whisper rose from the depths of the room, soft at first, then growing steadily clearer, weaving through the air like a spectral chorus. It was a chant, ancient and haunting, pulling at the very fabric of my being. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of unseen presences gathering around me, their voices melding into a harmonious lament that transcended time. In that moment, I understood. I was no longer merely an observer trapped in a decaying building. I had become a part of the prison's endless story, a thread woven into the tapestry of memories, regrets, and hopes that bound the phantoms to this place. This was my induction, my acceptance into a legacy I could neither refuse nor escape. With trembling breath, I rose, the cold air pressing against my skin like a solemn benediction. Outside, the first pale light of dawn struggled to breach the horizon, yet inside the prison, time seemed to hold its breath, suspended between what was and what would never be. I stepped away from the podium, my reflection fragmented in the dusty glass behind it, a man changed, forever marked by the echoes of Millfield, bound to guard its secrets and to bear witness to its ghosts, until the walls themselves crumbled into silence. The cold clarity of that voice sliced through the hum of my cockpit instruments, commanding yet disembodied, as if it belonged to a time long vanished yet unwilling to let go. I hesitated, fingers frozen above the controls, my instincts warring with the strange allure of those phantom lights beckoning from the darkened earth below. Despite every modern navigational aid telling me otherwise, I began my descent. The world outside the windshield seemed to bend subtly, the familiar constellations twisted into unfamiliar patterns, and the horizon shimmered like a mirage born of a fevered dream. The runway emerged from the night like a specter, pristine, yet utterly devoid of life. Touching down was surreal. The tires met the tarmac with a whisper, and the usual chorus of ground activity was conspicuously absent. An eerie stillness wrapped the airfield in a shroud, thick with unspoken histories and silent farewells. My boots echoed on the pavement as I moved toward the terminal, the muted glow from the windows casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of sight. Inside, the terminal was a museum of an era lost to time, polished wood panels, brass fixtures tarnished with age, and flight schedules printed in typefaces I recognized from vintage travel brochures. Yet no passengers stirred in the waiting area. No voices filled the air, only the low murmur of the aged ventilation system struggling against decades of neglect. Approaching the check-in desk, I spotted a ledger lying open, its pages yellowed but meticulously kept. Names and dates scrolled across the lines, a record of arrivals and departures that spanned generations. My own call sign was listed repeatedly, including entries dated in the near future, penned in handwriting that bore an uncanny resemblance to my own. A sudden chill brushed my spine as the realization settled in. I was not merely passing through this spectral airport, I was a part of its endless itinerary. The line between reality and apparition blurred, and I felt the weight of countless departures and arrivals, a ceaseless journey through shadows and light, a liminal space where time folded upon itself. Turning back to my aircraft, the world outside had changed. The terminal's glow faded into the creeping dawn, and the runway dissolved into the earth like a dream upon waking. The radio fell silent, the phantom controller's voice gone with the night. But within me, a new frequency resonated, an unspoken invitation to continue the flight into the unknown, to navigate the skies not just of geography but of time itself. The dead of night held secrets no daylight could unveil, and I was now its reluctant passenger, bound forever to the spectral runways that lie just beyond perception. The hum of the ventilation system mingled with the faint scent of machine oil and dust, creating a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to pulse with silent tension. My name is Marcus Webb, and as the lead maintenance technician at the underground research facility, I'd come to accept that this was just part of the job, long hours in a cavernous, forgotten place where the past and future often felt like whispered echoes rather than concrete realities. Level B7 was the lowest accessible floor, a maze of dimly lit corridors, locked vaults, and experimental chambers sealed off decades ago. The flickering lights seemed to hold more than just electrical faults, they were the first sign of something deeper, something that had quietly begun to unravel the carefully maintained order beneath the facility. At first, the anomalies were subtle. Tools left in different places from the last time I checked. Security cameras briefly glitching to static and then returning with images distorted like water ripples. Strange low-frequency vibrations that set the concrete walls humming with an unnatural resonance. But nothing could have prepared me for the night the lights went completely out for a full 7 minutes, plunging the floor into a darkness so complete it felt like swallowing blackness. I was walking the perimeter of the containment labs when the outage hit. My flashlight flickered in my hand, casting long jagged shadows that seemed to move against the direction of the beam. And then I heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the far end of the hall. Taps that didn't match the architecture, too soft to be footsteps but too purposeful to be random noise. My breath hitched as I moved cautiously toward the sound. Each step echoed in the vast emptiness, the silence so absolute I felt as if I were trespassing in a void between worlds. The tapping led me to an unmarked steel door that my records said should have been sealed for decades. But the door was slightly ajar, a thin crack of dim light spilling out like a wound in the darkness. Pushing the door open revealed a room frozen in time. Dust motes drifted through the stale air, illuminated by a faint glow emanating from an unknown source deep within the chamber. Rows of cryptic instruments lined the walls, their surfaces covered with layers of dust and faded annotations in a language I couldn't decipher. A large console dominated the center, its screens flickering with patterns of incomprehensible data. But what caught my eye was a figure sitting motionless at the console, translucent and flickering, like a ghost caught between moments. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, fixed on me with a patient intensity that froze my blood. I wanted to speak, to ask what it wanted, but my voice was trapped beneath a rising tide of primal fear. The figure gestured slowly, pointing toward the console. The screen shifted to display a map of temporal anomalies scattered across the facility, points where reality bent and twisted, where the past and future bled into the present like ink spreading through water. I realized then that the flickering lights, the strange vibrations, and the spectral figure were warnings. The research facility was a nexus for fractured time, a place where layers of existence overlapped and fractured. And I, Marcus Webb, had become the unwilling witness, the keeper of secrets that mankind was never meant to uncover. The lights flickered back to life, the spectral figure dissolved like mist, and the silence returned. But the seed of unease had been planted deep in my soul. The fluorescent bulbs on level B7 might burn steadily again, but the shadows they chased away would always remain, waiting in the spaces between seconds, ready to flicker back into life when the veil between worlds thinned once more. Each vehicle stood as a frozen moment in time, a whisper of lives intersecting with this strange, hidden level beneath the city. I passed a 1950s Cadillac whose polished chrome gleamed beneath the golden light. Its dashboard held faded photographs of smiling faces, and the scent of old cologne lingered faintly in the air around it. Nearby, a sleek 1980 sports car bore a baseball cap on the passenger seat and a crumpled letter from a hospital emergency room, dated 2 decades earlier. The details were uncanny, painfully human, reminders of moments lived, joys lost, regrets buried deep. The silence was immense, broken only by the soft echo of my footsteps against the polished concrete. Yet, beneath that quiet, I felt the weight of unseen eyes, not hostile, but expectant, as if the cars themselves were waiting for their stories to be heard once more. A sudden flicker caught my eye, a shadow at the far end of the cavernous parking expanse. I swung my flashlight beam toward it, but there was nothing there, just empty space and rows of vehicles gleaming like trophies in a museum of forgotten time. The air grew colder, a whisper of breath against my neck that vanished when I turned sharply. I tried to steady my breathing, feeling the pulse of the place beneath my skin, a rhythm out of sync with normal time, a heartbeat that echoed decades of memories, both joyous and painful. The cars were more than metal and rubber. They were vessels of moments, frozen in amber, trapped between the ticking of a clock and the endless drift of forgotten days. I reached a sleek, black sedan and noticed the license plate bore the name, Webb. My pulse quickened, a deep, unfathomable connection pulling me closer. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing an immaculate interior, untouched by dust or age. In the glove compartment lay a faded photograph, a younger version of me standing beside a small airplane, smiling with an innocence I'd thought long lost. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, floated through the air, curling around me like smoke. The temperature dipped further, and I could feel the building itself breathing with anticipation. I knew, somehow, this was no mere parking garage. This was a liminal space, a crossroads between what was, what is, and what might yet be. I stepped back, my heart heavy with the weight of countless stories waiting in silence. The cars, the place, the shadows, all waiting for the next passenger to arrive and pick up the threads where they had been left. With one last glance at the glowing button marked B8 on the elevator panel, I pressed the call. The doors slid shut with a hiss, and as I ascended, the amber glow faded behind me, leaving me to wonder what other secrets lay hidden beneath the foundations of the city, and what stories I might one day carry with me. The chill in the room deepened as the test pattern pulsed in steady rhythm, its monochrome bars washing over the screens like a spectral heartbeat from the past. I reached out, fingers trembling, to adjust the tuner, but the image remained locked in its eerie stasis. Channel 7 flickered again, and suddenly the screen shifted to a grainy news broadcast from that exact day in 1962. A young newscaster with a crisp suit and nervous smile spoke solemnly about an unexplained blackout that had swept through Denver just hours earlier. The reporter's eyes met the camera with an urgency that transcended time, as if reaching out to me personally. Static whispered through the speakers, intertwining with the broadcast, fragments of voices speaking in half-remembered conversations, distant cries, and the soft hum of machines long silenced. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the past was bleeding through the present, demanding to be heard. I scanned the room, heart hammering, the glow of the ancient equipment casting elongated shadows that seemed to twitch at the edges of my vision. The radio waves crackled again, this time with voices I recognized, old friends, co-workers, and family members long gone, all repeating phrases I'd said in moments I tried desperately to forget. The tower's LED lights blinked erratically, a chaotic Morse code of impending revelation. My breath caught as I realized the static wasn't just noise, it was a message. A warning from a fractured time, encoded in the ghostly signals crawling through the equipment. For the next several hours, the signals shifted between eras, snippets of broadcasts from the moon landing, distorted calls from lost emergency lines, even faint music from forgotten jukeboxes, all weaving a tapestry of history that refused to stay buried. As dawn's first light threatened to break the spectral broadcast, the monitors snapped off one by one, plunging the room into darkness. Yet, in the silence, the static's final whisper lingered, a promise that time itself was unraveling, and I was caught in its unraveling threads. I packed up the tools with shaking hands, the weight of the unseen pressing down on me. Mount Perdition was no ordinary tower. It was a conduit, a fracture in the fabric of reality where past and present collided, and the secrets it held were far darker than any technician should ever uncover. Walking back down the mountain, the cold wind carried distant echoes, echoes of voices that still whispered through the static, waiting for someone to listen. The revelation crushed me like a tidal wave. I was not just a witness, but an essential part of an intricate mechanism weaving through time itself. The broadcasts weren't random anomalies, they were threads in a vast tapestry, and I was the weaver caught in a loop of my own creation. Each Marcus web on those screens was linked, a single consciousness fragmented across timelines, compelled to maintain this growing network of temporal broadcasts. The equipment, the signals, the impossible architecture of Mount Perdition, all tools and symbols of an unfathomable project beyond human understanding. My hands moved on their own accord, tightening screws, soldering wires, and adjusting dials as if guided by a force older than myself. Every action felt preordained, rehearsed in the shadows of countless other lives I had lived or would live. A cold dread filled me as I realized that this work was both prison and purpose. The tower was not just a transmitter, it was a gate, a locus where realities converged and diverged, where past and future collided in an eternal dance. As I continued, the storm outside raged with a fury that mirrored the tempest within me. Lightning illuminated the dark room in violent flashes, revealing the countless monitors reflecting infinite versions of myself, trapped in the same cycle of creation and destruction. The voices from the static no longer whispered, they commanded. Echoes of my own future self warned of consequences too terrible to imagine if the signal ever fell silent. The tower, the broadcasts, the fractures in time, they were all bound to me, and I to them, forever entwined in a fate that transcended the linear flow of existence. I glanced once more at the monitors, at faces that were mine yet not mine, eyes filled with silent pleas and desperate warnings. The storm outside reached a crescendo, the building shuddered, and I understood fully, I was the keeper of a fractured reality, tasked with holding the threads of time from unraveling. The question remained, how long could I endure this endless night, and was there any way back to the life I once knew before the broadcasts consumed me utterly? The weight of this realization settled over me like a shroud. I was no longer just a man, but a node in an eternal network of fractured existence. Each version of myself, scattered across infinite timelines, was bound by the same inexorable duty, to sustain the signal, to perpetuate the cycle, to be both prisoner and warden of time itself. As the tower thrummed beneath the storm's fury, I felt the boundaries between past, present, and future dissolve into a shimmering haze. The blinking red lights no longer marked a single location but a vast constellation of interwoven realities, all pulsing in unison with the same cold heartbeat. In the hollow silence between transmissions, I heard faint echoes, voices speaking through static, voices that were mine, yet not mine, carrying warnings, regrets, and a shared understanding born from countless lifetimes tethered to this endless task. I am the transmission. I am the signal. And in this infinite dance of creation and decay, I have become both the message and the messenger, forever caught in the space between what was, what is, and what must never be forgotten.